All right, and I'll update on Twitter. Okay.
I am curious, like, what copy of the book you have, because I waited quite a while and my local bookstore did not have it, so I had to order it off of Amazon, and this copy sucks.
Oh
Oh
no.
no!
I listened to it with an audiobook, but like, look, I need you to see how small the text is.
Oh my gosh!
I feel like a lot of like random little, like, I don't even want to say publishers, but like companies that make money off selling public domain books do that, where they're like,
Exactly.
Alice typeface we can print it on, send it out.
We got to save money on paper.
I remember that the first copy I got of Tenant of Wildfell Hall,
Yes.
because I hadn't read it. I didn't know anything about it. And it was like, there's no way that was the whole book. It was like 100-something pages. And I'm like, this is a scam. What's going on here?
Yeah, this one doesn't even have page numbers.
Oh my gosh.
And so this is like the cover they have on the Wikipedia page. So when I was looking it up, I was like, oh, okay, well, this is the cover. This must be it. But now I'm looking at it and I'm like, looks like this was like, it's a little crunchy now that I look at it.
You're like, somebody phoned in this project. Okay, finally updated on Twitter. Alrighty.
That's what I'm doing on Instagram as well. I wish we had fun colored fruit emojis. I want to throw a purple strawberry out there and be like,
no.
Yes.
But alas.
Okay. I keep thinking of like, oh yeah, I meant to put that on my list of questions. So
Love that you're so inspired though.
I really am. Okay. This is one of the ones where like the whole time I was reading, like I have no interest or plans in being a teacher, but I'm like, I'd love to teach this book. Like that would be
well, so that's fun. These live shows.
Yeah, exactly. So this is my course on.
You just give us like a pop quiz.
I know.
Oh my god.
Righty. Lovely.
Bento might be hopping about. He's got his little like blank curious eyes on.
He sees something we do not.
It's a fairy.
Definitely.
If there's a fairy, he's got it. Actually, no, he killed his 6th mouse this week.
Oh,
good boy, but also yikes. Like,
and he also learned to jump on my bookshelf because he knows I can't reach him there.
Sneaky.
Found out I was short.
I've discovered Mom's weakness.
This is dangerous knowledge for him to have. Like, oh boy.
Oh boy.
I still think regularly about that meme one of you sent into our group chat where it's like these 2 tall ladies, like celebrities, and then it's like the short one.
I think it was Julia who said that. It's like, we need to do a group photo recreating that.
And no, actually, wait, it's the opposite, because it's Nicole Kidman and Reese Witherspoon and Zoe Kravitz.
Oh, it's like so a little tear.
It will exactly be our photo when we get together.
Perfect.
I love that.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start with the introductory stuff. Not so much introductions of us, because y'all know us. We've been here. If you would like to know more about Taylor and Julia, please check them out. I have linked both of them in the description. Currently on YouTube hiatus, but if you subscribe to their channel and lovingly pester them in the comments, perhaps they will post content. I'm just saying. And my channel obviously is Wild Book Garden, and I also want to mention that either like the last video or one of the last videos I posted actually included an update on the rest of our selections for the year. So be sure to check that out to see what we have coming up. But today we are going to be discussing Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. I really love my edition. It is similar color scheme to yours, Taylor, but
Stop bragging about your wonderful edition.
I'm sorry. So before we get into the actual discussion, I just want to go over some content warnings. Some of these will definitely come up. Some of them probably won't. But just to be safe, I'll list all of them. This book does deal with grief, suicide, murder, kidnapping, sexism, ableist language, classism, animal death, and I forgot to mention specifically there are several executions that happen. They're not on page, but definitely happen, come up in the book. So let's go ahead and jump in. Normally we tend to start out with like, what were your previous experiences with this author or this book, or any like knowledge that you might have about it. But I know that Taylor and Julia both mentioned like you guys weren't even aware of it. I have actually read it once quite a while ago, and I remembered very little about it except for a few like specific images. So it was very interesting to read it again. So in lieu of the normal intro question, I wanted to ask you guys, just sort of generally speaking, what your experience is with these kinds of like old world classic fair folk kind of stories. So that could be like, classic fairy tales, or there's quite a few novels, especially I think from this time period and a little before, about somebody having to cross into fairyland to rescue someone. That's like a very popular sort of adventure story. So I don't know if you guys have anything you want to mention about that. And it's fine if you're like, I haven't read those.
Julia, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I'll be the person who goes, I haven't read those. Because even as I'm like trying to rack my brain right now, I'm thinking of things that are like very still recent in terms of, like Catherine M. Valente, Fairyland,
Right.
and
That's a good point. I should mention, if you want to include like, this is not written a long time ago, but it has a similar sort of like, there's like different ways of portraying fairies, and obviously all authors are going to have their own spin on it, but I feel like this is a specific perspective. So that's Catherine and Valente is a great example if you want to kind of include like modern writers, but they seem to write about them in an old world kind of way.
Right. Because I would say, like, that's how I described, I've only still read the first Fairyland book, which I know is a shame. But like when I read it, I was like, this feels like a book that was written a long time ago, even though it's still very recent. But yeah, I am like really racking my brain trying to be like, have I read a single old-timey fairy tale book? And I can't really, in terms of like fair folk, fairy type stories. Yeah. And I sure don't think I have. I just like have this general, like mental, probably pop culture influenced image of like, oh, those wily fae folk. Like,
yeah.
But yeah, I got nothing.
So in terms of like modern interpretations of the fair folk, I have read my trash queen Sarah J. Maas's books.
Okay. I've read some ACOTAR, so
yeah,
I'll include that.
I've read like the first 3 books, and that deals with the fair folk. There are some aspects of it that I think are interesting, others that I think are a little too weird. Like wings being erogenous zones is wild to me. And I kind of hate it, but I think it's very funny. But in terms of the more traditional literary sense, I read a lot of Grimm's fairy tales, and I feel like I must have read something in. I know I read a few of the Lancelot, King Arthur stories in college for Britlit 1. Don't remember much of them, but I feel like some of those stories like dealt with fair folk as well.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
Yeah, so those are, both of you guys, great answers. And it's always kind of interesting when we each have like a different sort of starting point. So I have read, I would say like a decent number of like original fairy tales, as much as you can ever call a fairy tale original. And I've read a few fairy classics, I think, as well as some more modern ones like Catherine and Valente. Julia, you brought up, I think, is a great example. Or I've also read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke, which, like, the vibes and the atmosphere very much like remind me of each other. It's a book that I really love, but I understand why a lot of people hate it. And then what else talking about? Oh, Juliet Marillier, I think, is another one where she's a writer currently publishing books, but she writes historical fantasy, and I really feel like she nails this specific sort of like feeling, like not quite the same, but a lot of similarities. And then Taylor, as you were mentioning, like Sarah J. Maas, it's like, even though I tend to think of those as like a specific portrayal of fairies, like thinking back to like what I've read and what I know, it's like there are common threads about like, you know, not being able to lie or like making promises and different, you know, like things like that, like fates. Okay, so that's where we're
sorry. I totally forgot Terry Pratchett, his We Free
Oh,
Men book that's
yes.
part of I don't know if it's part of Discworld, but We Free Men deals with fair folk, and I know Neil Gaiman is also like incredibly invested in Lud-in-the-Mist and Hope Mirrlees' world. I know it's controversial right now, but that's who came to mind.
Yeah, he actually wrote the foreword of this edition.
Wow, did he? Did
well,
he?
I heard us, so for counting
forward.
Yeah. I am so glad, Taylor, that you mentioned the We Free Men, because I was thinking of that as I was reading and I completely forgot it as an example. But yes, the Tiffany Aching books are very much like what I was thinking of, where it's like a classic, like somebody has to go into fairyland to rescue somebody. I also thought of the Labyrinth movie. Reminded me of this one quite a bit.
Oh, I love Labyrinth.
Yeah, it's
got me excited now.
Yeah. Just like the aesthetic and like the vibe and the atmosphere and some of the like story pieces. I'm like, oh, this, I wonder if the people who made that movie, like, not necessarily read this book, but were influenced by some of this kind of story.
There's also sorry.
No,
You're unlocking so many memories that I didn't have when it was my turn to speak. I was going to say the Guillermo del Toro Hellboy movies. I know it's movies, but you mentioned Labyrinth and even Pan's Labyrinth, which is another Guillermo del Toro movie.
I was thinking about, yeah. I've never watched it. I think it would creep me out too much, but my sister loves it, and I know of it.
Girl, ooh, it is a rough time.
Yeah. It's scary. It's really good, but it's scary. But the second Hellboy movie, one awakened a lot of feelings in me towards monsters, which we can put aside for another discussion. But they deal a lot with like the fair folk and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think last thing before we get into, now I keep coming up with one of the things that I think is interesting is I've seen a lot of people say like that they don't like fairies, like they don't like fae stories, and I totally get that. Obviously people can have that preference, and I'm not arguing against the preference, but I do think it's interesting that I feel like from what I've seen, a lot of the criticisms of like fae stories are not necessarily things that tend to happen in the ones that we've been talking about, like the more like they're, you know, creepy, but they're also beautiful, and it's like you don't make bargains with them and you don't trust them, but you're curious about them, like that sort of like, I don't know, push and pull between like humans and fairies and all of that. I think that is like, that's the kind of thing I find really interesting in fae stories. And so I think it is, I don't know, it might be a subgenre worth checking out if people don't think they normally like that. Yes, Julia.
I forgot I read An Enchantment of Ravens.
Oh yeah.
Which is very, very fae.
Yeah, and I like, when I read it, I liked too that it had some of those classic elements, but it also like a little bit of like the author's twist on it. Like I remember one of the things I thought was so cool is that like all the fairies have like their glamour, you know, like their like beautiful sort of overlay, but there's always one thing wrong with it. And I thought that was really cool because a lot of like fae stories sort of deal with like the uncanny or like almost uncanny, and you're not sure why you're disturbed. So that segues perfectly into this book.
I was going to say, I can't wait till we're 50 minutes into this live show going, oh, and I read this. Oh, and I've seen that.
There's so much to talk about in this book, even in like introductory stuff. So obviously, if you guys want to share anything about your overall thoughts, if you want to share your rating, we can do that. And then together with that, I would love to hear how you would describe what kind of book this is. I feel like I ask this question a lot. As somebody who loves weird genre mixes, I feel like I'm always asking this question. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like a one-word answer, like you would shelve this book in blank. I just like to talk about how varied it is in its genre ingredients. Yeah, so overall thoughts and how you would describe the story or like vibe.
So overall, I enjoyed this book. I listened mostly to the audiobook because I think I mentioned this before we went live, but so other people know, my copy has ridiculously small writing, and I was not willing to lose what little eyesight I have over trying to read it. So I listened to it on audiobook, and I would like to try and read it again physically because I think I would get more out of it than I did. But overall, I'd give it about, I think, a 3.5. I think it was slow in some places, and then it would pick up really quickly, and then it would slow down again in a way that like couldn't always keep me. That being said, I liked our protagonist. I loved the murder mystery aspect of it.
Yeah.
I thought that was like my favorite part of the whole thing. And this book surprised me in how funny it was. There are some lines that like creep up on you. And in terms of like genre mixing, so maybe fantasy murder mystery is sort of what I think of. I also think of British because it is a very British book.
They're so British.
The humor, the writing style, the diction, all of it just, and I know that's because Hope Mirrlees is British, I think, right?
Yeah.
Or did I make that up? I think she was a contemporary of Virginia Woolf, and they knew each other.
Yeah. Great answers. Yeah, I definitely agree that like there's lulls. There's like, and it contrasts so much with the really like interesting, as you said, murder mystery parts. Like I honestly love to see Nat just going around solving murders. Like that would be really fun. But I think that definitely contrasts, and maybe it makes the slow parts feel even slower. Julia, your thoughts?
I'm weirdly similar to Taylor for different reasons. So I loved the writing of this book, like the actual craft and the writing. Chef's kiss. That was my favorite part. But the problem that I had while reading it was that because it started in a way that was kind of like slow and lyrical and really kind of leaned into like this really fanciful prose, I was like, okay, we gotta, ride this out. It's gonna be maybe a little bit dry, but these characters seem really interesting. And so like I girded myself for this kind of like character driven story, and then she's like, JK, it's about plot, and she like dropped this murder mystery on me. So it really threw me for a loop, and I was sad because I really was enjoying time with Nat, and then anytime I was like feeling like I got a handle on him, they were like, we're gonna go check on the farm, and then I was like, okay, I'll just like lean into Ranulph and like latch onto him, and then I was like, no, this kid sucks. Okay, what about Luke? And then Luke was there, but then he wasn't, and then we'd be with another character, and then we would go to the school, and I was just whiplashy for me. So
that's
all that to say, I also ended up at 3.4 stars, 3.5, because there were elements that I really, really enjoyed, but overall it was hard for me to consume as a book. I think I would actually like it better as like a television miniseries, like that I could get into.
There actually is like a radio series with Neil Gaiman as I can't remember, one of the villains. It's
Well, I'm
either
trapped now.
or I'm so bad with fantasy names. I'll read like the first syllable and I'm like, that's your name.
You called him Peppa.
What's his name? It starts with an E.
I've been saying Endymion or Endymion, something like that.
Endymion.
Endymion. Yeah.
Okay, wait. I think that was one I tried, and for some reason I couldn't remember that.
I started off not saying that, and then halfway through, I was like, wait, wouldn't it be pronounced like this? And then in the 11th hour today, I got a phone call from my mom, and she was talking to me, and I was like, Mom, I love you so much. I have to finish this book for book club. And then I panicked that I wouldn't have enough time, well, because I'd already been talking to her. And so then I resorted to audiobook for like the last 10% of the book, and they did confirm Endymion.
Endymion. Okay.
That's why I say it with such confidence.
Yeah. Also his I guess real name or previous name was Christopher Pugnose, so we can also like for Pugwalker. So we can also call him Christopher, I guess.
Feels weird. How about Lear?
Names in this book, when I could remember them, were very funny.
Yeah.
Silly and very
loved the names.
Yeah.
Although
Julia,
it's
did you
weird,
have... Oh, sorry.
they seem like nowadays, I feel like the human names are like what nowadays people would like name fairy characters, you know? They'd be like, oh, Ivy, what was her name? Like Ivy, whatever. Peppercorn and
it's like Moonlove Honeysuckle.
Yeah.
They sound like you looked at a fairy name generator or like a crunchy granola parent naming their kids. Like Moonlove.
Moonlove. It really,
it's like,
yeah.
Pick a word for the birth month and then for the first letter of your name. Oh, my fairy name is Moonlove. Oh
my gosh. Yeah. That is what they feel like. Julia, did you have any thoughts to add on like sort of genre or like what kind of story?
Yes. Yeah. If I was trying to like explain this book to someone very quickly, I would be like, yeah, I'd be like, I don't know, take it. I would probably say that it is I don't even like struggling. A historical fantasy that focuses on a murder mystery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good description. My overall thoughts and rating, I actually gave it 4 stars. And that's the same thing I gave it the first time I read it. And this is interesting to me that you guys both specifically mentioned, oh, I liked Nat. I thought we were going to like follow him more. I did not like Nat. This was an interesting book for me where like I found basically all of the characters to be fairly unpleasant. Luke and Hazel were like the only ones that I was like, I genuinely like you. It's fun to follow you. And Nat, I will say, I felt sympathy for him and he was interesting, but I had a really hard time getting over his complete lack of like empathy. And I think it's really interesting that he goes on this huge journey for a son that he even admits to himself he like doesn't actually care about as a person. He's just like offended that this happened. And we get a glimpse at the very end that maybe he does care more about him than he thinks. But I swear this man forgot he had a daughter. Like
I forgot he had a daughter.
Yeah, like Prunella and the other girls are like equally in danger. And I'm like, nobody's even mentioning, like he's like, well, she's gone. I gotta go get Ranulph back though. And I'm like, sir.
I would have sworn if her name was not on the cover, I would have sworn this book was written by a man. Because Hope has no love for women.
Yeah, that was like one of my other big complaints is that other than Hazel,
yeah,
and like maybe a little surprised that Dame Marigold, you know, has a semi-functioning brain. She just doesn't seem to like women at all.
Yeah. And it was like we got little glimpses that would sort of give me hope. Like there were some lines about like the wives all getting together and it's like our husbands don't understand this, but we're going to figure this out kind of thing. Like that kind of gave me, you know, a hope that maybe we were going to have like at least a sort of balancing like perspective, but it didn't really happen. And I think maybe some of it could be attributed to like who we're reading the story through, because honestly, like Nat doesn't also doesn't seem to care about his wife very much. So it could be that some of the like general apathy or dislike of women could be a character choice. But there were also places where it's like I don't know. I'm wondering if maybe this is like the author's feelings that are sort of like coming through
Yeah.
into the story.
It's like the scenes where Nat isn't like, we're not in Nat's perspective, that makes me sort of think that Hope maybe doesn't have the fondest opinion of women.
A lot of internalized misogyny, I think.
Yes.
Like,
because even Hazel, who's arguably the most likable female character, we get that whole like, and she ran upstairs and she cried about it, and finally she came back downstairs. I'm like, give it a rest.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's kind of like surprising to me that I enjoyed this as much as I did, because that was one of my issues. The fact that I'm a character focused reader and I'm like, I don't really like any of you guys. But I think, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, but I think that's one of the things that makes this a very interesting book. And I kind of feel like the characters are intentionally unlikable or unheroic, because it's very interesting to me that we get this classic hero story, and instead of like a good person being motivated by their love for somebody, it's like a fairly mediocre to unpleasant person being motivated by nothing very much, like, which is interesting. And I think another thing that like elevated this book for me, besides the writing, which I also loved, I thought it was gorgeous, another thing was like just the number of like themes and ideas that really like spoke to me. Like anytime this book talked about like longing, I was in it. I was so like vibing with that whole thing. So I think that is like, that's a very specific thing that, especially in classics for some reason, maybe it's something to do with the writing style, but it's like Peter Pan, so many issues. But one of the things that absolutely gets me about that book is the bittersweetness of growing up. Like, I will never be over that. I will never be over that. So like, I don't know, that comparison made sense in my head. But 4 stars, surprisingly, but I absolutely agree with the criticisms here. Okay. So what do I have next? Okay, let's go ahead and just talk about, we did this a little already, or I sort of like gave away the next question. How do you guys think this is different from a lot of like heroic rescue stories? Like, we sort of talked about this a little already, about like normally you like the hero and normally they care about the person they're rescuing. But if you had like any other thoughts on that, and also like, do you think, like, what do you think the effect on the story was? Why do you think maybe Hope Mirrlees did that? And anything around that, I guess.
I mean, I'll start off by saying I give Nathaniel a little more credit than you, in that I do think he cares about his son earlier in the novel than the end. But I do think in the span of the first 12 years of your son's life, that probably is too late to be noticing that you love your son. He's like, oh, wait.
Yeah.
However, I lost how that connected to the question.
Well, it was a very long question, so I don't blame you. It's like basically this being not a classic hero, not a classic rescue story, and how effective do you think that was, or why do you think maybe the author chose to do that, if you had to guess?
Yeah, because it is weird in the sense that I feel like a lot of sort of like, I go to this place to save X person is very much like, you go there, you arrive, you have trials and tribulations, you're tested, your love is tested, and your intelligence is tested, and your heroics are tested, and then hooray, after defeating the wily bad guy, you bring your loved one home or whatever. And I feel like this was none of that. Instead of like even going there until, again, like the end, he was just like, well, it's the law. I've got to stay home. So hopefully we can figure it out from here.
I guess I'll just solve a murder while I wait. Like,
yeah. So it's a bold choice. It's interesting.
I think I forgot to mention this when we were talking about, like previous experience or whatever, but one of the things that I did remember was like, obviously that Nathaniel does go into Fairyland to bring his son back. I like was convinced that happened close to the middle of the book. And it's like almost the last thing. Like it is, and it's not even really focused on, which I find fascinating. That it's like we see what he does there, and I think it's kind of cool that like he's doing the trials not even knowing that he is, kind of like, I find that very interesting. And some of the trials I thought were very clever. Like I love that he basically solves one by being a pedantic know-it-all. Like, that's great. I think that's really funny. But it's very interesting to me, and I think one of the reasons that this book can feel kind of slow and meandering is that the big plot thing that you know about kind of from the back of the book happens almost at the end, and also that it's not made that much of by the story. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know if you had other things to add, Julia. I sort of just like took over.
No, I'm kind of just rambling, so interrupt me whenever you want.
Well, I can hop in.
Yes.
So with Nathaniel, what I think is interesting and like separates him from your average like fantasy hero trope is like the everyman is already like a trope, but usually it's an everyman destined for greatness, or an everyman who takes up the mantle and becomes this. But this is an everyman that is middle-aged. I think the book describes him as like a little like chubby. He's tired and he doesn't necessarily want to abide by or like take on the call to action. He'd rather just let it sort itself out, and then eventually he's spurred on into this story. So I thought that was a very interesting take on the hero, because he's not what you would think of. Yeah. I think the other thing that's interesting is that the more like fantastical elements are literally on the periphery. You have like a little bit of that coming into the like Lud-in-the-Mist, or what's the country called?
Dormer.
You have things smuggled inside, but the fairies themselves don't really come into the character's world, and he doesn't really cross over into that world until later. There are some of those elements, but he himself doesn't spend much time in the fairy world with all of the fantasy elements.
Yeah. And the fairy fruit is just like drugs. Yeah. Like, it's not even that fanciful.
Yeah. Okay, so great answers from both of you as usual, and I think you guys said it really well. That it's like he's just like personality wise, and even like the story's focus on the great heroic act is not really emphasizing it. And I think it's interesting that one of the things that I feel like often happens in these kinds of rescue stories is that like when the character goes off to save this person, like a lot of times it's either like a romantic interest, or if it's not, if it is like a sibling or like a family member or a child, then it's like them deciding to go off to save them is like sort of what makes them realize that they do care about. Like Tiffany aching, that happens when she's like, I couldn't stand my little brother, but like I don't want anything bad to happen to him. Labyrinth, very much the same. When he is actually taken from her, Sarah's like, oh no, I hate this. This can't go on. And so I find it interesting that a lot of what we see in Lud-in-the-Mist is like Nathaniel, even if he does sort of start realizing earlier, it's really like bringing Ranulph back that makes him realize that he does love him. Like not just like he is my son and I defend my son, but like actually cares about him as a person. Doesn't seem to have that same moment about Prunella, but baby steps, I guess.
Well, she's only a girl, so.
You know, fathers love their sons and mothers love their daughters. Children are only for the parent of the same gender.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so as far as the mystery element that we all mentioned, I think we all said that we really liked that. I also found that incredibly well done, and just like I would read more mysteries of like Nat just being nosy and like figuring out other people's business from like a few decades ago, and just like the creepiness around the mystery, like realizing that like, oh, Ranulph, as unpleasant as he is, he's a little kid staying with a murderer, a straight up murderer, and like hoping that the other characters are going to figure that out in time to do something about it. So I don't know if you guys had any other sort of like thoughts on the mystery part, or how that kind of contributed to like the feeling of the book, because I feel like I even said this, I think, in our previous live show when I was introducing it. It's a very interesting mix of like cozy and creepy.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you guys had contributions on that.
Well, as you know, I really liked the murder mystery element. I wasn't expecting Scooby-Doo in this, but I do like the idea of them unmasking and
Maya?
Thank you. My brain was like endometriosis, and I'm like, no, that's not his name.
We can call him Lear, you guys. His last name is easy.
But like unmasking him and finding out he's like Pug Whistle or whatever, like very good. But overall I thought it was like a nice element to include, and just following like him trying to solve the mystery, like reading the legal document first and being like, well, she's innocent, and then like going back and going like, wait a minute. I love that stuff. And I mean, I loved the female villain, Widow something.
Widow Gibberty or whatever.
Yes, Widow Gibberty.
I don't know. I find her so like comedically evil. Like when she was trying to kill Nate, and she just dragged a stove into his room and turned it on. I was like, that's really funny. I know it's probably a smaller stove, but I love the idea of her dragging like one of those old timey huge stoves in.
I think it sort of like implies that she put something on the fire that was like a sleeping or like poison sort of thing. But yeah, the fact that she's like, oh, this will keep you nice and toasty, and that's like, yeah, all right.
That makes sense.
Seems legit.
It does get pretty chilly out here. Thanks, Widow Gibberty.
Yeah. And Hazel once again saves the day. She's like, this is sketchy AF.
Like, why does this man need a stove in his room? That's a little weird.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, I don't know, just watching Nate uncover it, even like the part with him and his friend Ambrose.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, I like them like going around and like solving the mystery together, and their little fight and their little makeup and their whole bromance.
Yeah. And I also thought the sort of red herrings were done so well, because they ended up not being red herrings in the way that we thought. Like, there's even a part at the end where the characters are like talking about like, wow, so weird how everything came like full circle. And like when is it Nathaniel or Ambrose who asks Lear like, hey, do the dead ever bleed? And he like flips out, and of course you think like they do that it's because like the fairy fruit dripping out of a coffin, which is also a creepy image, that is what he's like feeling guilty about. And then it's like, nope, actual murder. Literal murder.
Which is a fun piece of mythology, that like when the like someone's killer comes near their body, it starts to bleed. It's a very creepy image.
Yes. And that was a real thing that people believed in. I want to say it was like medieval period, but I don't know for sure. But like that was actually something like a superstition that some people believed. Some people at the time also thought of it as a superstition, but I remember that was an actual sort of like idea.
Did that come up in The Pale Lady?
I think so. I think it might have. it was at least referenced, I think.
Yeah.
Also, like the fact that they're like that scene where there's like the funeral and there's a corpse and like fairy fruit is like dripping out of the coffin, which again, even knowing that it's fairy fruit, still very like creepy, still a very like uneasy sort of
like guys,
image.
you clean the body up a little bit more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just throw it in a coffin willy-nilly.
So it's interesting to me then, does this suggest, and I just thought of this now, does this suggest to you guys that that person did die of eating the fairy fruit? Because why else would they have? I mean, I guess it could just be like a coincidence, but the fact that we're specifically told
like
about
in the middle,
person in the funeral, like during the funeral, like the person there.
Yeah, like the person. Yeah,
I assumed that they were like using the funeral as a front to like sneak in the fairy fruit.
that's
Okay.
how I read
No
it.
one's gonna look in this casket. We'll just fill it with fruit.
Also, super creepy, like eating fruit that was like taken out of a coffin. So that's
You can't eat at everyone's home. You don't know if they cleaned it or anything.
oh my gosh. Okay. So
I know Julia had some
yes.
thoughts on the murder mystery.
I was just gonna say the murder mystery was not my favorite part of the book.
Ooh.
I was like, this is standing in the way of rescuing people. Like, I for me, it was like, I don't know what word I'm looking for. Not a hindrance, but I was like, okay, I get like there's stuff going on here. So to me, it just felt like a really prominent B plot.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to go to Fairyland and rescue the children. And then it was like, oh.
Every
okay.
time we heard like little tidbits of like the fairy history or like the Duke Aubrey period,
Yeah.
like I found that so interesting, and I would have liked to see even more of that as well.
I also, I'm gonna say right off the bat, as we're 40 minutes into the live show, right off the bat, I am convinced, or not convinced, but I am ready to be convinced, perhaps, that this book is better than I perceived it in only. I can't even talk today. In that I don't think I really got a lot of it. Like I'm still leaving the book being like, so what was that about? Or like, what's the significance of this? And I'm just like, I don't really know. I'm gonna be straight up with you guys. I don't know.
No, that's fair. Like it is very, like I had a minute of like, especially the last couple chapters, I was like, okay, so this ending is suggesting that this thing in the past that we thought happened this way actually wasn't as bad. So like I had to sit down and do some like, the trigonometry meme. That was me. Like
well, and like what about the note? Like I still don't really get the note, the capital N note.
Yeah.
Longing.
But he was scared of it. That's not longing.
Yeah, but
That's
I think
fear.
it's like restlessness and like the sense that there is something out there that is like beautiful, but it's uncertain and you're comforted by certainty. Like it really reminded me a lot actually of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the first book, The Magician's Nephew.
Okay.
There's a part
I read that one
where
yet.
You what?
I haven't read that one yet.
Okay, I won't get into specifics, but there's a part that is very similar in a certain way. But like it doesn't have the same sort of like implied emotion behind it, but anyway. Yeah, so I feel like the note, it definitely wasn't explained or like focused as much as I think it maybe should have been for how important it was.
Because I liked every part when it was mentioned. I was like, this is interesting.
Yeah, and I took it as like, when we get into the themes, this will maybe be like, I guess, easier to talk about, but it's like,
thank you, Professor Kara.
Yeah. I interpreted it as like representing like, yes, like the fairies and like this like separate world from the human world, but also just like the idea of sensing that there is something more than this provincial life, you know, like there was like this feeling of like something more or something bigger or something different. And how for Nathaniel, that was like exhilarating but also terrifying, because like this whole community, they're like certainty, like knowledge, like we have the law, like nothing unexpected ever has to happen, like, and we kicked out all the fairies and we kicked out the people who liked them, so like we're good now. And so I think that the note is like a crack in that sort of like wall, I guess. But I agree that it was very much like vibes, not really explanation, just vibes. Okay, last before we get into the characters real quick. Did you guys like, how did your perception of the villain, like who was the villain in the story, how did that change, or did it change in the book?
It changed a lot.
Yeah.
When we got first introduced to Lear, she was so generous with her descriptions, other than, you know, him being fat and short. But she's like, and he's a doctor and he cares about helping people. He's a doctor for healing's sake and for science. And I was like, wow, what a guy. Thanks. And then, you know, we meet. I read his, this is my opposite pronunciation thing. I thought his name was Portunus, but then the audiobook said Portunus, like opportunity. So, okay. But anyways, and because Hazel didn't trust him, I implicitly was like, creepy guy, I don't like you. And then of course there's the whole fiddling nonsense, and so shady to me. But then, yeah, the tables kind of turn very abruptly with them. So I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah, and even like at the very beginning, which again, I've read this, no memory of almost anything. No thoughts, head empty. So the beginning, when they're sort of telling you that backstory of about like Duke Aubrey and like the Duke Aubrey period and everything, which, side note, Anthony Trollope, that is how you set up important backstory that doesn't take 250 pages, just saying.
Imagine.
So one thing that I thought during that part, it was like Duke Aubrey was like a very interesting character, but like the way that they're describing like some of his like choices and the way that he was like ruling the people, I was like, ooh, okay, bad. We don't like Duke Aubrey. And then when Lear shows up, I was like, oh, okay, like he seems pretty good, like a pretty good guy. He's helping people. He's going out of his way to like treat people, even people who aren't nice to him, who don't like him.
Animals.
Even animals. We like this guy. And then my first clue that I was like, wait a minute, was actually the part where we find out that he basically created the fight between Ambrose and Nathaniel. That he's like, this will be funny. And I was like, ooh, that's not great. And then obviously things just got progressively worse as far as like Lear's moral compass. And I find it interesting too that his whole like merciful killing thing, even the way that is talked about is actually very creepy, because they're like, oh, he collects deaths, like he finds that interesting. And I'm like, ooh, all right, like widow. Yeah.
Now we want to hear about your doctor. Okay.
Reddest of flags. Like the Widow Gibberty is like the more obviously, like you said, Julia, she's like almost comically evil in a way. But even at the trial, they're trying to portray, the book I feel like is sort of like hinting that like she's the scariest one, and I'm like, I'm honestly more creeped out by the doctor. Yeah, and then by the end, I was like, we like Duke Aubrey, maybe? Like,
yeah, that was weird.
Very good elected.
The Duke Aubrey introduction, I was like, oh, evil man, terrible. The things she described, monstrous.
Yeah. So, okay, I was way off at first. I never trusted in Dr. Lear.
There you go.
Dr. Lear. I didn't trust him off the bat, but okay. So I thought maybe he was Duke Aubrey, sort of like trying to worm his way back into the community and sow discord. So that was my first thought. Then I thought Portunus was Duke Aubrey trying to worm his way back into the society.
You're like, somebody's Duke Aubrey in disguise.
Somebody out
Pulling
here.
off masks.
That's the Scooby-Doo of it all, you know? You
Yeah,
gotta-
yeah.
Exactly.
Wait, you were kind of right, Taylor, because they were both willingly or unwillingly serving him.
Mhm.
Yeah,
So
it's true. I did it.
big brain, yeah.
But I think what set me off was when I'm blanking on the kid's name. I want to say Randolph. I know that's not his name.
Ranulph.
Ranulph. Sorry, Ranulph.
How dare you?
But when Dr. Lear was going to like check in on the kid, and the kid just starts like freaking out and screaming, which, to be fair, that is one of the few times where Nat is like, hey, I think this might be a bad idea if my kid is like freaking, and immediately alarm bells went off. I'm like, I know it's not what one would assume. I know it's some sort of magic thing, but I immediately was like, I don't trust you.
Yeah. Yep.
But also, I feel like she set that up in a way for us to be like, well, I don't know, because like 10 pages before he had been like, don't cut that cheese, please. So like, it was like, well, how much do we trust Randolph's judgment of things? Because this seems pretty normal right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, also Willy Wisp. Sorry. I feel like he's just like a side villain, but God, he's so annoying. Just everywhere he goes, he's like, and I'm going to make things harder for you, and I'm going to make things harder for you. Bye.
He's like, I think in the foreword, maybe it's even like specifically mentioned, like they compare him to Puck from Midsummer Night's Dream, which I absolutely can see. But even though Puck does indeed make things harder for everyone, I feel like it's not necessarily as like malicious as I feel like Willy Wisp is. Like, he knows what he's doing and what the consequences will be. And I think that's one of the things that I find so incredibly interesting about fairy stories, is that in especially some of the ones that are this kind of like classic feeling fair folk, it's so interesting to me how a lot of times our perception of them as evil, because of like the evil things they do, it's like caused by like they literally have a completely different code of ethics and a way of seeing the world, which is not to excuse the bad things they do, but I find that so much more-complex and interesting than like fairies bad, you know. It's like they don't see themselves as doing something wrong, whereas with like Duke Aubrey, I think sort of fits into that category. Maybe Willy Wisp, I feel like maybe doesn't, because he like fully understands like what is going to happen, and he enjoys doing it. Well, I guess Aubrey does that as well, but
but it's not so much that fairies are evil, it's that fairies are chaotic.
Right. Chaotic neutral. Yeah. And it's like their danger comes from the fact that they are so different from us. Like they literally can't understand the way that we see the world or like view choices.
It's like a grizzly bear. Like a grizzly bear is not amoral for killing somebody, but to a grizzly bear, it's like, this is how I react to this situation.
Yep.
They are the same way.
What, Taylor?
Sorry, I was just like, I love slaughter, because that's just how grizzly bears are. But I love them. They're so friend-shaped.
So friend-shaped.
Okay. I have like actually a pretty short section on characters, because I feel like surprisingly this wasn't a character focused book. Like we talked a lot about the writing, or we're going to talk about it more even for quotes. We talked a lot about themes and plot. So I don't know if you guys we kind of covered all this already. The only ones that I had specifically, Nathaniel, which we talked about, the Widow and Lear, which we also kind of talked about. I did mention Hazel and Luke because, like, again, MVPs, saving the day,
Yep.
being decent people. I do also like that everything was resolved and came together because of Hazel's aunt, I think it was.
Oh,
Like
Ivy
this
something
one,
Ivy
yeah.
Peppercorn.
Ivy Peppercorn.
That's my favorite name.
This
Queen.
one like random ordinary farm wife, like that, and that's one of the things that I'm like, okay, maybe the like the women hate is not like as bad, because they do seem to be, apart from Nathaniel's like adventure, like they do seem to be the consistently competent ones.
Oh, sorry. I was
No.
just going to say, like, from a generous reading, I could also see, like, Hope more making fun of, like, upper middle class and upper class women in, like,
Yeah.
the beginning. And then as you move, like, out of the city where you get more, I guess, middle class people, like, maybe that's her being more charitable to them than she would be to rich ladies.
Except for Bawdy Bess.
Not based on how she treated the teacher and the laundry lady and everyone else in town. I got feelings, okay? What was I going to say? Oh, but how weird was it? I don't understand this man's motivations. I'm so interested in Nat, but I don't understand him at all.
Interested but confused.
Yeah. Yeah. I just don't get, as he's like going around trying to like snoop and figure things out, he's like, and in this location, I'll be this character. And he's like coming up with fun little personalities. I'm like, just pull rank. Be like, I am the guy in charge. Tell me what I want to know.
But that takes the like fun and like intrigue out of it.
He really is like, this is my chance to put on a one-man show, and I'll be damned if I let common sense or logic take that away from me. Like,
I can't remember which one it was. I don't know if it was when he was talking to Ivy Peppercorn or maybe when he met Hazel. But it was like he genuinely, like the narration started to go off on a tangent where he was like, and if this is who I was, then this is what I would do in the evenings, and this would be my life. It's so nice in someone else's shoes. I'm like, Nathaniel, focus on the mission.
Him coming up with like the backstory for the cheesemaker, and he's like, this guy would be a bit of a flirt. I don't flirt with younger girls, but this man, the cheesemaker.
This cheesemaker? Oh yeah.
He's a bit randy.
Hazel really appreciates an older man, apparently. So we were told.
Yeah. Character ages in general were very vague in this book. I'm like, is Randolph like 14 or is he like 8?
Like, I think he was 12.
Okay. He is 12. Luke is 17 and Hazel is 20.
Okay, I thought Luke was 20 and Hazel was 17.
No. And in either case, listen, I know it's problematic at the ages that they're at, but I really wanted the end to be like, and they ended up together.
Me too.
That's what was going to happen.
Yeah. She gets with that random pirate instead.
I know.
I do kind of love her because I'm like, listen, I get it. He's large and dangerous. I understand.
He's a sailor.
Yeah. A pirate in my mind.
Oh. I got distracted while we were talking about the character thing. Yeah, like I do feel like that is a thing that like there are people that are just, because Nat is so self-centered, and so I kind of absolutely believe that even though he's like solving an actual murder, he's like, I'm gonna make this fun for me though. Like this is gonna be so fun. I can be so clever. People won't know who I am. And I find it really funny too that at one point he's just like, oh yeah, I'm the mayor, so you have to tell me. He goes through all of that backstory, like the deep lore of this cheesemaker. At the very end, he's like, on second thought, I'm the boss. Like, undercover boss.
Oh my gosh.
He shows up like the mayor and widow Jibbity is like like those people who talk like shit about their jobs.
Yeah, she's the one who gets fired at the end of the episode.
Yeah. No.
Luke gets a raise. He gets a paid vacation.
Yeah. We love it for him. I was kind of taken aback by the fact that like after the trial of Lear and the widow, that they were like, and everybody, everyone knew that it was capital punishment and the punishment was death. And then they did it. They straight up, like, immediately, they're like, and then they were hanged at dawn. And I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
Oh, there they
okay.
go.
There's a lot
We're
of
moving
hangings
quicker
in
than
this
I
book.
thought.
And they kept them up there before, like, some people were like,
Oh.
we're going to take Dr. Lear down because we like him too much. Which, to be fair, is very realistic for, like, a man in any community that's relatively well liked. It's like, of course, people are going to stand by him.
Yeah. Julia, what did you say before? I think
I just said there's a lot of hangings in this book.
there are. There
Kinda
are.
brutal.
And I like Diggory's backstory. I should have put Diggory on the list.
Oh yeah.
I feel so bad for him. Like, it is so heartbreaking for no real plot relevant reason. Like, I don't know. I mean, I guess because he's Portunus, right?
Not confirmed.
Okay, but
I
we
thought it
think
was-
maybe he is.
Like, Portunus, like, he died and became Portunus
I
because
think so.
there's that element of, like, dead people join, like, the fairies. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which also, is that common lore? Because that's a weird thing.
It is. I actually have a note about that. And I think we're pretty much done with characters anyway. So I also had the Duke, but we already talked about him.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was actually a very common belief going back to like Celtic, like Ireland, Celtic Britain, like that area. It was actually like part of their belief system that like the other world and our world were basically right up next to each other, and they were only separated by like a veil. And on certain days, like Samhain, the veil would like part or like would become very weak, and so then fairy creatures and the dead, like spirits, could like cross over and cross back and forth. And there was a lot of overlap in the beliefs around like the sheath, or I think I'm probably saying that wrong, but like the fair folk and the spirits of people who had passed on. Like, it was the other world in the sense like that it was the afterlife, but also that it was like literally another world where like magical beings lived. So
that's so interesting.
Yeah. So it is actually a pretty old belief. And that was one of my questions I wanted to ask you guys is like, what did you think about that? I found that incredibly interesting. And even the fact that it wasn't, I mean, I guess in the novel, it's a little more like clearly defined than it is in some of the like older like stories or practices that we know about. But anyway, sorry, go ahead, you guys. Thoughts on this? I'm just like getting off into my own.
This is like separate from the book, but you talking about Samhain and the idea of the veil lifting reminds me so much of Day of the Dead. This idea that like dead people can cross over on a certain day.
It's very similar, yeah.
Just very interesting because it's two completely different cultures.
Yeah. And it's so cool seeing these like commonalities in the like beliefs and practices. And and like I think I've mentioned this in a previous discussion, but there in a period in like Celtic history when it was like just, like the Christian missionaries were showing up and they're like, everybody's a Christian now. But there were still like remnants of those older beliefs, and especially for I think like the whatever you would call like the working classes at that time, they were like simultaneously still doing both, and it was not at all considered like conflicting. So they were like, okay, I'm going to leave an offering asking the Virgin Mary for help. Also, I'm leaving something out for the fairies because I don't mess with them. Like, that was just a really normal overlap for a lot of people. And so I don't know, I find that interesting as well with this overlap between like the dead and the fairies.
That is interesting. I think that does kind of play into the like the menacing quality that the fairies have, because that goes along with like how a lot of people feel about like the idea of ghosts and stuff, is that they're like this spooky entity, right? And it's not like a ghost is showing up in your house to be like, can I watch a movie with you? It's like here to haunt you. So, you know, that would make sense that it's like, oh, okay, these fairies or these spirits or whatever they are have some sort of ill intent or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
It also sort of like makes me think like if a lot of the fair folk in this book are also, you know, dead people that sort of became fair folk, you could say that like fairyland sort of, I guess, represents this idea of like fear of death, and that's why everyone wants to like push it away, and they don't want to acknowledge it and like think about it at all.
Does Bento have a bell on?
Yes.
No, great, because it sounded like it came from in my house, and I'm like, I'm being haunted too.
Fairy's here right now. Like,
actually, Bento just hopped on a plane and joined you. I fed him too late this morning, and now he's mad.
I'm protesting. I'm out of here.
He did knock over my inhaler. I was reaching for it earlier on the table, and he just went.
Little stinker.
Wow. It's like, I will withhold breathing from you if you do not please me.
Oh, you want
to breathe? Taylor, I love that connection that you made. I think that is, it definitely feels like that's one of the reasons that the author incorporated that like belief into the story, is it really does work as like a symbol for fear of death, and even like what we've been talking about, like fear of uncertainty and the unknown, you know, like what is death if not uncertainty? So I think that's a really great connection. It's also interesting to me, and like when we're talking about some of these other holidays that have a similar idea of like the dead being able to cross over in specific circumstances, and Taylor, feel free to share more if you would like to, but it's a very positive holiday. Day of the Dead is, and it's like a happy thing that you get to see your loved ones come back. It's not in the way that a lot of Western cultures view ghosts. Is that correct?
I mean, to be fair, I'm not like super in touch with the Mexican side of my culture, but I will say there is a cultural difference between how my mom's side of the family and Western people, or, you know, Western American people in general, are very scared of death. And my dad's side of the family is like, well, yeah, we don't want it to happen. But I remember when my paternal grandfather was like near the end, and we were like, how are you feeling, Grandpa? And he's like, ready to die. And it was just so casual.
Yeah.
And it's the same with my paternal grandmother too. We were like, Grandma, you need to take your kidney like dialysis, otherwise you're gonna die. And she's like, so I'll die. They were both ready to go, and they were very open about that. So like culturally, I do think there's a different way of viewing death as something that's like not scary. Although to be fair, like they were both in their 80s, so like they were probably I'm done.
I'm tired, yeah. And also like it being a holiday about specifically like leaving offerings for your loved ones who then can come to visit, like that is a very positive, like that's not a haunting, you know, in the way that like we think about it.
It's a gesture of love.
In other cultures. What's that, Taylor?
It's a gesture of love.
Exactly, it's a gesture of love. And I find it very interesting that for Lud-in-the-Mist, it is not a positive thing. Like they believe, and it seems like it's confirmed later, that people who die, at least some of them, do actually become fairies. Like the whatever like crossing to like the afterlife involves, you do end up going through fairyland, and some people, if not all of them, do become, you know, fair folk. And it's really interesting to me that that is like a scary thing and a bad thing, and people like they don't want, they're so scared of fairies that they don't even want like the people that they care about to come back or to visit or to even like, they don't even want to acknowledge that it happened. And then at the end of the book, it's very different, and it seems like the scene that we get described to us seems much more similar to kind of what you're saying, Taylor, about Day of the Dead, it being like a thing of love and like a welcoming back people who you have lost, and it doesn't seem like they're scared anymore. So I don't know. I don't know if you guys had thoughts on that, but I found that sort of like arc for the community to be really interesting and cathartic.
Yeah. Like a bit of a cautious acceptance of death.
People go, yeah. Yeah, because Hazel had that whole part when they were talking about like, oh, is Portunus, Diggory? And then she was like, well, I didn't know him, but they said Diggory was like this really nice, sweet man, and this guy ain't him. So if that is him, like clearly, that process like twists who you are and changes you. So that was interesting, I think.
Yeah.
Because sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. No, go ahead, David.
I was gonna say that's like another fear if like I guess like you see your relative again after death and it's not them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure like that is something that would be really unsettling. Like even if you want your relatives to like cross over, but there's someone that is essentially unrecognizable, that's terrifying. Like something happened to them.
Right. Like they're familiar. Like
I recently read Crooked Kingdom, so I'm very sensitive about this right now. I'm fine.
So good though.
Carry on, keep talking.
Sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
I'm good.
What were we just talking about with the
death, changing,
right
coming back?
Yes, and like the fact that it is almost somebody that you love but not quite. Like I think that is like a very specific kind of frightening. I think there was something else we wanted to say. Well, if I remember later, we can come back to it. Okay, so other kind of like themes and motifs. The fairy fruit we have talked about a little bit, but do you guys have any other things you want to say about like what it maybe could symbolize, or like what it represents, or even just like in the story itself, kind of like what it, I don't know, its function or what you think about it as a device?
Yeah. It was very interesting, again, as someone who hasn't read a ton of like fairy lore, but my perception of what the whole like fairy fruit, fairy food deal was is that like you eat it and then you like forget about your past life and you just stay stuck in, fairyland or whatever. But this was quite different in that it just like kind of addicted you and drove you a little mad, and I don't know, it was a very separate experience from what I traditionally read about fairy food. So I was like, interesting.
Yeah, and like even in like Goblin Market, for example, very well-known poem that has also inspired and been inspired by a lot of other sort of fairy stories. Like in that sort of category, I feel like what I usually read is that yes, you get addicted to it, but it's like you basically starve because the only thing that you want to eat and the only thing you're willing to eat is the fairy fruit. And here, that doesn't, like, it seems like it's more of like a moral danger, like I don't know, it's like we don't actually hear about if this does eventually kill people. Maybe it does, but it's sort of like the panic and everything trying to do something about it happens before that would be an issue, which I think is really interesting. And I did remember the other thing I wanted to say. So when we're talking about like the arc of the community being a little more comfortable with the idea of death, like obviously still, most people aren't like looking forward to it, but it's still like something that you can maybe find more peace with than before, and that's what happens in the novel. I also find that really interesting because it sort of parallels the way that some of the characters, especially again the more like working class people, the way that they view like fairy fruit, and where it's like, well, if you have like what is it that the nurse says where she's like, a healthy stomach can even digest fairy fruit, which is like it's a funny thing to say because it's such a practical way of viewing it. But I do think that's kind of interesting that it's sort of proven correct by like what happens at the end of the book. And in my head, that sort of connects to what we were saying about like death being less scary if you are less scared of it. You know, like you sort of have to make that first, like, I guess, step. And similarly with the fairy fruit, it was maybe only a danger when people treated it like it was evil, and that if you ate it, you were lost, you know? So,
Yeah.
that wasn't even a question. That was just rambling about it.
So, that, what you said sort of reminds me of, and this is me putting on my, I got an English degree at an overpriced university, so we gotta make it work.
Go ahead, I'm listening, ready to take notes.
I do find it interesting if we think that fairyland and the fairy fruit sort of represents knowledge of death or the unknown. You could draw a parallel between that and the whole biblical Adam and Eve thing, especially since there were, like, most of the people afflicted in this book were young girls who start acting like frivolous and not like young ladies, and eventually leave Lud-in-the-Mist for fairyland.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up, Taylor, because that was one of the things specifically that I noticed. And I think Lear even, I think at one point he explicitly like compares the fruit to knowledge, and so of course that made me think of like the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of the symbolism or like the ideas in this book, I think a lot of it does deal with like knowledge versus sort of blissful ignorance.
Yeah.
But something that I thought was interesting is that I feel like in the book, the fairy fruit itself and like, you know, eating it and being worked on by it, it's not nearly as like, I don't know, like sexually coded as it sometimes is.
Yeah.
Which I found very interesting and kind of refreshing. Like, it wasn't like, you know, they eat the fairy fruit and these girls run off to fairyland because they're little sluts. You know, it was like, and it wasn't even explicitly like they went off seeking freedom. It was just like they know about it now and they are sort of like enchanted. Like, I mean, it's against their will. They don't want to go to fairyland. So I don't know if you guys had thoughts on that like comparison. Or
Well, I guess it's like they don't want to lose that ignorance, but
yeah,
because now they have knowledge of it, they can't stay in Lud-in-the-Mist.
yeah,
I mean, eventually they can come back, but
right, which again sort of fits into like the idea of like longing and, you know, knowing about something more. And once you have that knowledge, you can't just pretend you don't. Like Nathaniel with the note, or the characters who have tasted fairy fruit, it's sort of, I guess, like in a way the fruit could also symbolize dissatisfaction, but like in a positive way, like a sort of adventurous way, I guess.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
One last thing, if we're about to move on, is I know Hope Mirrlees lived in Britain, but since this was written in 1926, I wonder if any of her inspiration for how the society or Lud treats fairy fruit is based off of American Prohibition. The idea of smuggling
Yes.
it in and it being something that like no one wants to deal with, but eventually they bring it in like moderation because it's
Right.
moderation.
Yeah, the whole like each
A little silly.
Yeah. Yeah, like that's a great comparison. I don't know if she maybe was influenced by that, because it is very similar, that like idea of a substance that, yes, it can absolutely be dangerous and make you do things that you wouldn't normally, and it can even kill people. But if you sort of like respect it basically and handle it responsibly, then you can safely partake. And even the fact that like they have it at a celebration at the end, very reminiscent of alcohol, which also is not to say that people who choose not to drink any of it, that like they're doing it wrong. It's just like very interesting from like the novel sort of seems to suggest like if you are somebody who is going to, it is possible to I guess be responsible about it. I just keep thinking of like enjoy responsibly. Like
well, also because prohibition didn't even work.
Like, it really didn't.
Sure didn't.
Okay. Okay, I think
I'm looking right into camera.
Hi, baby. What do you think, Bento?
He thinks he's gonna clean himself about that.
Oh.
Well said, sir. Okay, a couple more little like motif things, and then the last thing that I sort of have is talking about like, do you remember getting those assignments in classes where it'd be like, choose different literary devices and explain how they are shown in this piece, you know? So the last sort of theme thing that we're going to talk about that I think we might have more to say on is about like juxtaposition and contrasts. So before that, the last couple little theme things, one of them is this like valorizing of the law. It's like always capitalized. So my question for this is, how do you feel this emphasis on the law, how do you think that surprises you or doesn't, I guess, about the fact that it is the humans who are using it? Like, sorry, that's a very confusing way to word it. Basically, what I'm asking about is the way that the human characters view the law and manipulate the law. Does that make sense to you for a story where it's humans versus fairies, basically?
Interesting. Julia,
I had to ask in a roundabout way because I don't want to like answer it for you.
I mean, I see where you're coming from in that I feel like we talked a bit about how, like, you know, fairies, they play by their own rules. Like, they do have rules. It's like, again, it's like pirates, right? Like, pirates have a code. It's not a normal person's like code of ethics, but they do have their own rules. And I feel like fairies are very similar in that. It's like, well, that's how they do it. Obviously, as a human, we might be like, that's a bad thing to do. And they're like, that's fairy culture for you, babe. So yeah, it's interesting to have the humans so focused on like the law, we have to follow the law. But also I feel like it was so interesting that there was this continued thread of like, what did he call it? Like the fiction of law, where I was like,
Gold star in your paper. Gold star in your paper, Julia.
And, you know, it's kind of in the same vein, too, of like, you know, like history is written by the victors is like, well, laws are just what the people in power decide should be the rules. And sometimes, you know, there are ways of skirting around the law that still follow the law. And, you know, like, I don't know. I'm losing my thread of.
No. You exactly hit on one of the things that I wanted to talk about. So, Taylor, before we do that,
I'm going to open my mouth, and what Julia just said is going to come right out of my
mouth. Expand, unpack that for me.
I guess the big thing for me is also because I listened to the audiobook. It wasn't until I was listening to the audiobook and following along that I realized law was capitalized. So after that, I was like, oh, maybe there's a theme about laws here. But I will say, I guess this sort of like desperation to uphold the capital L law to the society, I do like that they called them Luddites.
I know isn't that like clever? Yeah.
But I feel like the Luddites feel like it keeps them from whatever chaos is happening over in fairyland. Like that's what separates them from the fair folk.
Yes, That is also a great answer, because I feel like what you've like pointed out with that is that it is the humans' way of imposing order, which is the opposite of how they view fairies and whatever's happening beyond the debatable hills. And then Julia, your point was, like I said, exactly one of the things that I had like thought about with that question, and why I asked it in such a weird way is because like even though there is that part of like, yeah, the human fixation on the law and how it's like this is certainty, like we know what the law is, there's also that very consistent theme throughout of like everybody who is involved, I think, with the law, especially Nathaniel. One of the things they love about it is that it's made up, essentially. They're like, I get to create this order out of nothing. And the way it's written feels to me much more like how a fairy character would view rules, because it's like the classic, like they can't tell a lie, but they deceive you with the way they tell the truth kind of thing. To me, that really mirrors the way that the humans use the laws, which actually, in hindsight, might be even more brilliant than I thought of the author, because like if there is this crossing over of like humans becoming fairies, and like Duke Aubrey sort of like, is he one or the other? That would actually make a lot of sense if like what the humans think sets them apart from the fairies is actually just like more of what the fairies do. They just have a different name for it. So both of you get gold stars on your papers. Excellent job.
Gonna put it on the fridge. I'm so excited. Also, I feel like I had to say this kind of in a previous point. I'm not sure where. So I'm just going to include it here before I forget the thought too. I kind of like how like part of the like class distinctions in the novel are like the fairy stuff in the more like rural settings is very much like superstition and like part of their culture in that way. And then when we're in what's it called, Doramere, it's very much like about manners and propriety. It's like, we don't say that word because that is like improper to say in mixed company. And I'm like, what? I think that's a clever way of like including fairies in a novel like this.
Yes. And even the fact that like in the laws they have such a horror of saying the word, that they're like, you've been importing silk improperly. And even to the point where like if somebody is brought up on charges of like eating or distributing fairy fruit, they're like, we now will go over all the different kinds of silk. Like everybody, it's wild. Everybody in that room knows that they're all lying, and they still do it, which has a very interesting connotation for modern society. Yeah.
Going off of your point, Julia, I just really love how different the language used in this book is, particularly like the swears.
Yeah.
Son of a fairy, or my great aunt's rump, or something.
I love their exclamations.
There's
so
like the really whimsical, like by the sun and moon and all the stars, and then it's like Busty Bridget. Like, wild. Which again makes sense, because if they view talking about anything to do with the fairies as being vulgar, so even though the swears sound poetic, they would still view them on the same level. As other things. I like, Julia, what you brought up about the different classes like view of fairies, because something that I think is interesting is, and maybe I don't know, maybe you guys didn't feel this way. I feel like from the book, there's sort of this like underlying, well, the superstitious peasant folk were actually right. Like they actually had the most like practical solutions. Like even I think Hempy is her name, like the old like nursemaid, who she was kind of fun. And she's the one who has that whole speech about like healthy living. Like if you just like, you know, live your life well, you don't have to be worried about fairy fruit and everything. And it's sort of like implied that Nathaniel and the other, you know, wealthier merchants and townspeople, that they're like, okay, Hempy, that's ridiculous. Like we're fond of you, but you're not very bright. But like she's right, that's exactly what happens. And then even with Luke, who is also sort of written in a way that is like not stupid, but like, you know, he's a little like an uneducated farm boy. Like his heart's in the right place, but he's not too bright. And it's like he's right too, because he's like looking around and he's like, this widow doesn't use fennel. Everybody uses fennel to keep the fairies out. And like that is in fact, because like I think Lear, is he suggested to be a fairy, or no, it's just because he's like serving Aubrey, who is a fairy, so that's why she doesn't use fennel. But it's just, I don't know if you guys noticed that or if you had like opinions on that, but I thought that was actually very cool and very subtle, because again, there are definitely places where I think the classism is like unintentional, like it's not commentary, but I do feel like they're like, if I had to pick which class comes out the best, it's like, yes, Nathaniel has his big heroic rescue, but in terms of like the actual worldview, the like superstitious, uneducated peasant folk like nailed it.
Yeah. That is a really good point, especially about Luke like not noticing the fennel, because Widow
Djibouti.
Thank you. Widow Djibouti, like I already was suspicious of her, but him noticing that also made me go like, oh, something's up here.
Right, like, wait a minute. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and I like Hazel, her like emphasis on like hospitality is also very interesting, because that is also a very like traditional sort of value. And it's, you know, it's like even going back to like the ancient Greeks, one of the worst crimes was harming somebody who was a guest in your house. Like that was how important hospitality was and is to a lot of like societies. And so I feel like with Hazel's character, it's kind of, I guess, similar. Like it's not specifically like fairy related, but her like old fashioned views about like hospitality and taking care of people are actually very important to the plot. And I think it's even like stated that like her motivation for agreeing to testify against the widow, which would have been terrifying, and she, you know, murdered her own grandfather, so like she knew she was willing to hurt people. Like I just think that's very interesting and cool as well, that like her sort of peasant values, I guess, would be the kind of unpleasant way to describe it, but it's like that sort of is what helps Hazel be heroic.
Yeah. Well, and also Dickory was the one who like first inspected Widow.
That's right. And he was a farmhand, which is like very much not a respected position, which is ridiculous, because they did like 90% of the work on the farm, and they're like, oh, classic. Yeah, that's a great point as well, Taylor. I hadn't thought about Diggory in that capacity, but absolutely. Okay, I think the last, before we get into my essay question, is I wanted to talk about two things that are, in my opinion, they're not like major themes in terms of page time, but I find them incredibly interesting. So we're going to discuss them anyway. One of them is the way that art is talked about, and especially at like how the art of the Duke Aubrey period is contrasted to Lud-in-the-Mist now, and then also at the end. And then the other one is the idea of outsiders in a community. So if we want to take those separately, we can. But, and again, there's not like a ton of time spent on them in the book, so we don't need to like go super in depth. But I definitely noticed, and I wanted to hear your guys' thoughts. Julia's ready.
So that like in the beginning, I think it's in like chapter 2, maybe even chapter 1, like that was what really caught my eye about the writing of this book, was them talking, well, not them, like Hope Mirrlees talking and writing about like the art that's in the attic, right? I love that passage. I basically underlined the whole page. And I love the description of like history holding on to its secrets, right? Like they're
Yes.
sharing it with us because they're encapsulating it in this embroidery or this music or this story or whatever. But even though it's called like, harvesting or springtime, it's like that's not what that looks like now. So even though you're sharing a previous everyday experience with us, it's so different from what we know now that like we can never fully understand it. And I love that.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yes.
That's incredibly interesting. I gotta be honest, I love the descriptions of the paintings, but for some reason my brain was like, and there's nothing more to these at all.
Well, see, I got so excited about it. I was like, this is important to plot. I'm glad I noticed. And it was not. And she never talked about it except like once ever.
I do think though it was one of those minor details that we were encouraged to pay attention to. Like it wasn't super plot relevant, but the fact that it's brought up again at the very, very end of the story in like the little epilogue sort of thing, I think it is important. And yeah, I loved, I mean, look at the number of tabs. This is like kind of ridiculous for me at least. Yeah, lots of beautiful lines, or clever and interesting lines, and I loved the descriptions of art, and especially like you were saying, Julia, the uncertainty, of art. And I find it so interesting that the Duke Aubrey period is like, we have all this like beauty and imagination and like whimsicalness, but also like the kind of uneasiness as well, which tracks, makes sense with what we know about Aubrey and the other fairies. So we have like it's beautiful but it's scary, which again represents the fairies. And then during I forget what they called the period that's like when the book is set, basically after like the other humans and merchants were like, actually no, let's not do this. So in that period, it's like art wasn't done at all, hardly. Like it was very like prosaic, very like run of the mill, and that was intentional because they like didn't trust the like pretty stuff, but also maybe they couldn't do the pretty stuff, like because they didn't have that like imagination brought to them by the fairies, or by like accepting the existence of the fairies. And then at the very end, we're told that like art started to come back to Dormer, and that was like a big deal, and they were like exporting all these gorgeous things again. And I feel like what that kind of reminds me of is like people will say that like, suffering brings good art, which I hate that, and I don't think that's true. What this book says, I think, is more interesting and more reasonable, which is like you have to be willing to, I guess, like be open, like be aware that I don't know how to say it. I'm struggling. It's like you have to accept that there will be uncertainty, and you have to be okay with that. And I feel like that is sort of shown in the like rise and fall of art in this community. So I feel like it was a lot of talking for not very much payoff at the end.
No, it was very good. It's like one of the reasons why I want to reread this with a decent copy of the book.
Yeah.
Physically, because I know I missed some things. So.
Yeah. I definitely, I'm glad I read it physically. So if that's an option for people, that is definitely what I would recommend if you have the choice. I think it's a writing style that for me really lends itself to like sitting with it, and again, tabs, lots of tabs.
Mm-hmm.
Although, can I ask again, this is maybe a thing of like, was I in my own zone? Was I not getting it? Because I feel like the beginning of the book really sets up a lot with Nathaniel, with like that, you know, hearing the tone and feeling like very alienated from other people, even though he doesn't really like seem unhappy with his way of life, but there's just something like in the back of his mind, like something's off that he's like afraid of. And even the back of our copy of the book, Kara, specifically says that he's deliberately ignoring a vital part of his own past. And so I was waiting for like some grand reveal of like, you visited the fairies as a child and it was wiped from your memory, or like a thing that happened. And I don't know if there was a thing that happened to him, or if it is just like he's kind of in denial about stuff.
I think it's the second one.
I don't like that.
Yeah, like I don't think there's any physical thing or like experience that he's hiding. I think it was about like the way that the note made him sort of like pay attention to a part of himself he didn't want to, which was like, again, the whimsy, the fact that he, I guess, is curious about fairyland, even though everybody is supposed to hate it and fear it. And I also think that maybe part of what it's referring to is the fact that like hearing the note and his like response to it is like 80% of his personality is from that, which I find so interesting, that like, you know, he loves to hear people's minute details of their lives, not because he's an empathetic person, but because he's like, oh, it's so cozy being a human. Like, even like the things, we get all these descriptions of him like enjoying his home life and everything, and again, not because he loves his family. It's because he uses it as like a defense against this like curiosity. I guess curiosity might have been one of the words I was struggling to come up with.
Yeah, that's a good word.
With the art discussion, is I think like you need to have curiosity if you're going to, at least this kind of art, if you're going to do that. It's like you can't do art without imagination, obviously. Mm-hmm. And I think it's pretty clear that the people in the city at this point in the story did not have really imagination. They didn't want it. They didn't trust it. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah.
Then I just take issue with whoever wrote the synopsis on the back of the book. I will blame Hope less, and I will blame them more. That's bad phrasing. A secret he refuses, deliberately ignoring a vital part of his own past, a secret he refuses even to acknowledge. Yeah, that sounds like an incident.
Yeah, that implies something like physically happening in the world. Yeah. And especially in a book where you have like a decades old actual murder, they make it sound like something very serious.
Yeah, like, did you witness this murder and then like block it out of your memory again?
But instead it's, I listened to music once.
I heard one note.
And it messed me up for life. Yeah. And then any thoughts on the like outsider idea? Again, this is in the same category of it's not plot relevant really, and it's not super focused on, but the fact that it is brought up in the way that it is, I find interesting.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I will be right back. So, Taylor, take it away.
Get it, Taylor.
Oh, God. Oh, no. I mean, I'm trying to think of, and where'd my book go? Here it is. Dr. Lear, wasn't he treated like with suspicion when he first came into the town?
Yeah.
And then he ingratiated himself to the townspeople, except maybe they shouldn't have trusted him as an outsider. And yeah. Guess you have this fear of outsiders or anything from the outside getting in. So I don't know. I guess it creates a sort of us versus them mentality with the Luddites.
Luddites.
Yeah, I don't have much for this question, and I apologize.
No, like, I mean, and that's basically what my thought was as well. I didn't have like a super long prepared like answer for it, because I also just kind of got the feeling that, like, especially with the end of the book, it's like, okay, change is okay. People like outsiders, you know, coming in is also okay.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting you brought up Lear as an example, because yeah, like he isn't welcomed at first, and then he makes himself useful to the community, and that sort of wins people over. So he's sort of an interesting, I guess, counterpoint. But I do feel like overall, if there is a message about outsiders, I feel like the bottom line of the book is like welcome them and accept them, and they're part of life, and that's okay. So again, like not being afraid of uncertainty or change.
Yeah. I guess maybe there's this element of like being cautious about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like how they start letting in the fairy fruit with like not regulations, but kind of regulations.
Right. Like right.
Yeah. And then, you know, the idea that someone that they let into their community also ended up betraying their community. I do wonder if part of it's like, you should be welcome to outsiders, but also be careful.
Yeah. Yeah. And even the fact, like, so the widow is originally from, I think, a
The
different
North.
village,
Yeah.
right? So she's sort of an outsider, but it's interesting, like, that the bad things she did weren't actually in Lud-in-the-Mist. Like, it wasn't in their immediate community, I guess. So it's not quite, I feel like her character, it's not quite as simple as, like, sometimes outsiders bad. They kill people. But
Yeah. It is interesting that you brought up Widow
Gibberty.
Thank you.
Gibberty.
I think of In Sound of Music when they call her a flibberty gibbet. That's what helps remind me.
Good one. I keep thinking of Giggity, which I think a character from Family Guy says. But I hate that show, so I don't know why my brain is like.
That's hilarious.
But the widow, she also brings her stove with her from the north, and people, I guess, in Lud and like their area of the world, which I think they mentioned being the West, don't use stoves. They have some sort of superstition against him. And when she does employ this sort of like outside tool, she does it to like try and kill Nate in one of the funniest ways, but
in a very elaborate fashion.
a cask of Amontillado him, light a fire and hope for the best.
Yeah,
I'm picturing like a little samovar or something. Like I'm not picturing.
Oh,
like,
I'm picturing a huge.
no.
Yeah, like a wood burning, like 18th
She
century
drags
stove.
in like one of those medieval roasting spits that you see. Like, no, I also thought it was like a small one that you could feasibly use to warm up a room.
A space heater, if you will.
Yes, an old-timey space heater with added poison.
See, my brain just went to the most chaotic thing she could do, and it was dragging a huge, like super heavy stove.
Of course, full of wood, of course.
Yeah. Like, here you go. This is totally normal.
Yeah.
Just thought it would be a bit chilly in here.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Julia, do you have any thoughts on like the different ways that outsiders are like treated in the book? How you, if you want to take a guess as to the book's overall like perspective on it?
Yeah. Well, see, you don't want me to go last on this one because this was actually one of the things where I was like, I feel like we needed a stronger consensus on this. Like I wanted the incorporation of fairy in Doramare at the end to feel more like, we were looking at it all wrong. And for them to like have a sort of like, we were just, excluding them based on one idea and not like looking at the whole picture. And I felt like it was actually kind of weak the way it was handled personally. Because, and I guess it doesn't really help that in a novel with this chaotic of a structure, we have from different points of view so many outsiders, right? Like Ranulph and Luke are the outsiders when they show up on the farm, and Endymion Lear is an outsider when he shows up as the doctor out of the blue. And so like some of these outsiders are trustworthy people, and some of them are neutral, and some of them are people I would not want to encounter personally. And I guess just in that sense, to me, I wanted something a little more conclusive of a message versus, and I get that it isn't necessarily an issue that's like black and white, right? Like I would never be like, oh yes, let me just open up the front door of my house right now and let anyone who needs to come on in. Like that would feel chaotic and scary. So like I understand that, but I don't know. I wanted a more polished idea to that message personally.
Yeah, and I also like I don't want to overstate like how much it is a point of the book, because I don't even think it is like a main focus.
I think it should have been.
Yeah, I think it could have been, and I also agree like the ending, while I liked it, it felt a little abrupt for how much buildup we had, and I wanted to hear more about what it would look like to see a mix of fairy and human society, especially with the implication or confirmation even that like they had like intermarried, you know, that like that was a thing that happened quite frequently in the past. I would have really loved to see even just a little bit more of how the society was going to work going forward. Like I do like that we get like where's everyone now kind of thing. Like I enjoyed that. I liked where people's stories ended up for the most part.
I imagine it as like a freeze frame.
Yes, it's the end of a movie when they're like,
yeah,
it's got the writing.
Yeah, fades to black. Like, Luke went on to do
it. Yeah.
I think one of my bigger complaints with the book is that I wish we saw more fair folk. Like we get a little bit, but I think even the idea of either outsiders or what we were saying earlier about fear of the unknown, I think could be emphasized further if we got to see what everyone is so scared of. Like, are they justified? Are they not?
Right. Yeah, and especially like how much are we supposed to agree with the fear that a lot of the humans have about like, oh, people become fairies after they die and they change, like they're bad after, you know, like, because I don't think that is necessarily true about Hortunus. Although it's weird because like his descriptions are very much like sketchy old man. Like why is everyone just like letting him go wherever he wants?
Him, like pinching maids, and I was like, ooh.
Yeah.
And so Hazel's like he just follows me around even when I ask him not to. Like
yeah. So like all the descriptions around him, I was like, I don't like this. But then the things that he does where he gets Nathaniel to figure out what happened and like that to me suggests that maybe he's not as like corrupted as people would think. So yeah, I think that's one of the things that we definitely could have had more details about. And also Taylor, what you were saying about wishing there were more actual fair folk in it, I definitely agree. Like we were talking about how much we enjoyed the sort of like fairy history and like the lore and everything, and I would have loved to see more of that. And even like Duke Aubrey, again, from the beginning of the book, seems pretty terrible, but he's very interesting. And I would have liked to know, I guess, more about him or like who he is. Was he always a fairy? I think it's implied that he was a human who got too close to the fairies and then like they trapped him in fairyland. I don't know. Would like more details there. I think if I were to like recommend this book to somebody, which like again I did overall enjoy it, perhaps surprisingly considering some of the other things we've discussed, But I would definitely have to say, oh, it's like an old kind of classic fairy tale or fairy story, but there's not that many fairies in it. Like, it's more about the vibe, the fairy atmosphere, the fairy backdrop, the threat of fairy things happening, and once in a while you get an actual fairy.
Would we all say, I feel like Willy Wisp is 100% definitely a fairy. Are we in agreement on that?
Absolutely.
Okay. I mean, his name is basically Will-o'-the-Wisp, so I mean, like, if you're a human, that's a little on the nose.
Yeah. It's also interesting that I feel like the characters who come off the worst, like who have like the worst things happen to them in the book, which, you know, their choices also the worst. Like, I'm thinking of like the widow and Lear and everything. But it's interesting to me that the ones who have sort of the worst outcome are the ones who are like obsessed with the fairies. So it's kind of, it's like, again, that idea of like moderation. And I mean, like, one of the most horrible ones has to be Primrose Crabapple. Like, she was like obsessed with Duke Aubrey, in love with him basically, and lots of terrible things happened as a result. So I don't know if you guys had thoughts on that. That just sort of like occurred to me as we were talking about like the fairy characters. It sort of seems like that's another way that it recalls the classic fairy idea of like humans are drawn to them, but be careful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of mirrors like the fairy fruit thing of it's okay. Moderation. Don't go ham.
Yeah.
Yep.
Good thought though. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that is true with how the characters kind of pan out.
Yep. It's like you can have a healthy respect for the fairies. You can even like them and be fascinated by them. But don't get in too deep.
Everything in moderation.
Exactly. That's like the bottom line of this book.
Yeah.
Like, anything in moderation, including, I guess, love for your family.
You can have a little as a treat.
Yeah.
Including your methods of how to rescue your kidnapped son. Everything in moderation. I'll try to solve him a little. I'll try to save him just a little bit.
At the end of the book, Nathaniel's like, what a year it's been. And I was like, it took you a year?
I'm 13 now?
I was like, it's really funny. Yeah. I feel like you really dragged your feet on this.
Oh, buddy.
I think that maybe what I thought that was referring to was the way that time moves differently in Fairyland. And so, like, he's going on that whole adventure, and he's like, oh, I bet this is taking a lot longer than I thought. And then he comes back, and it's like a year later. But yeah, that's just.
I mean, that's
also, like, on the other hand, Nathaniel would, though. Like, he would totally take a year to do this.
Listen, I had to spend a couple of like weeks in a community college like acting program so I could learn how to be the cheese man. I had to LARP this.
I had to wait for them to construct my costume. No one was going to believe that my mayor garb was a cheese man.
Like, sir, you don't have to do all this.
You don't need to go so hard.
Fully committed to the bit.
He really was. I feel like Nathaniel maybe needed like another hobby. Like, the man had some free time, I guess.
Maybe like after the book, he gets into like local theater and becomes a champion for the arts.
Love that for him.
He becomes a drama teacher.
Yes.
I mean, we can only assume that the finishing school was shut down, so we're going to need some education in this town.
Yeah, I can't imagine that running anymore.
Boy. Yeah.
I do love the teacher's name, though. It makes me think of the
Crabapple.
Yeah, it makes me think of the one episode of Over the Garden Wall with the little one-room schoolhouse.
Yes!
I haven't seen it.
Taylor! It's almost peak Over the Garden Wall season. You have to
Yeah.
watch it.
Yeah, it's the perfect fall show. It is one of the strangest things I have ever watched, but in a good way.
It's the best media I've consumed in my entire life. And
Everyone has been
that.
telling me to like watch it, and every time they do, I'm like, I will, and then I watch Gravity Falls.
It's really short.
It's so short.
I know.
It's going to be like 2 hours of your life, and you'll be done. There are
so like, come on.
There are only 2 things in this world that I can watch from beginning to end. The only 2 things I can binge watch are Schmigadoon and Over the Garden Wall.
I haven't finished the latest season of Schmigadoon. I love that show.
I don't think I have either, actually. Okay, last question before we get to quotes. So this is our essay question. Basically, I think I mentioned this already, that like one of the things I notice a lot about the book is opposites, or like juxtaposition, contrast, all of that. So I thought we could just like, if there were specific examples of that you wanted to chat about, because I think that a lot of these, like I just had a few that came to me off the top of my head. And I think a lot of those like contrasts fit in really well to what we were talking about for the themes and stuff. So take it away.
Taylor, do you want to start off?
Repeat the question for a quick second.
What's that?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so
gotcha.
Yeah, and like contrasts and
okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. One of the things I could be wrong about how I interpreted the fairyland, because sometimes I just make up world building facts in my head when reading fantasy.
Love that.
Naturally. Mm-hmm.
But what I thought was interesting, and the way I imagined fairyland was very like black and white, and I could be wrong, just because when I think of Lud-in-the-Mist or like the book as a whole, I think of color, because Hope describes so many things in detail, particularly with color, but that could just be me trying to make the movie in my head work. But I guess in terms of opposites, you also have the controlled city of Lud-in-the-Mist versus the unknown in fairyland. And I guess my brain has stopped working.
It was a very open-ended question, so you're good.
I literally used 90% of my brain on that like Eve eating the forbidden fruit answer.
And it was solid. It was worth
it. It was. You're like, I can kick back, take this.
You're the student who raises their hand in class with like the best answer, and then for the rest of the period's like, I'm done here.
Okay, literally that is what I did. I got my class participation in. I'm good.
That's right.
So remember that answer. It was solid, and now we observe.
But Julie, if you have a much more eloquent and better answer than me,
I don't. Are you kidding me? An eloquent and better answer? I think again we have like the sort of I don't want to call it a city, but like the what sort of location would you say Dora Mare is? It's like a
prosperous country town, I would say. Like
I guess town is
small,
like you've got like the people of the town and their sort of society versus like the more pastoral life. And again, how those two different locations kind of view the fairies and how they fear and or respect those entities. We definitely have. Hold on, I can think of more. Give me a moment. I got them in there. I don't know.
I mean, we also did talk about. Oh, sorry.
No, go.
I was going to say we also did talk about sort of the difference in approach to the fair folk between the upper classes and lower classes in the society, and how the upper classes seem much more nervous about them and more like resistant to the idea of fair folk, whereas lower class people are a little bit more like lenient.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think those are all great examples, and I think similar to some of the ones that I had here. One of the ones that I thought was most evident in the writing was this very like prosaic everyday world with like the magical and the whimsical. I feel like that came through a lot in like how the Luddites ran their city and everything, and we talked about like the art, and even like some of the descriptions, which I'm sure we'll have quite a hefty quote section. But like
My
some of
time
the
to shine.
some of the descriptions of the different like tapestries or like artwork and stuff, it's like got that undercurrent almost of like this is more than our everyday world can handle, and we're scared of it, so we keep it in the attic.
Yeah.
We talked about knowledge versus ignorance a lot. I also, for that one, it also occurred to me that the opposite of knowledge in the case of this book could also be fear, because again, like a lot of this is like fear of the unknown, and how do you solve that is like knowledge, or I guess like accepting that you won't have like all the knowledge about it, like accepting that you cannot always be in charge.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last sort of one that I had thought of was the like longing or restlessness versus contentment.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily think that contentment or like satisfaction is supposed to be viewed negatively, like, oh, that you're not adventurous, you're not wanting things. I don't actually think the book is criticizing that. I think it's like, don't hide behind that when you do want something else, or you're curious, you're creative.
Mm-hmm.
Hey baby.
And I think in terms of storytelling too, we can add the contrast of the like sort of cozy, wholesome, like day-to-day events versus like the creepy murder mystery.
Yes.
And like again, the visual of like do the dead bleed is like so ominous and juicy. Well, juicy, not pun intended.
Yeah.
Video vampire confirmed. It's so
It's just-
luscious, so scrumptious.
So delicious, so mouth-watering.
It's so impressive to me too how like, and we talked about this with the mystery part, where it's like you have like a really creepy sort of opener. It's like, do the dead bleed? And it's like, whoa, and then you find out it's like fruit, and you're like, oh, that's not that bad. Wait, it is that bad.
It's so weird.
Like what do you call that? There's like a word for that where it's like a false alarm that then actually is really a true alarm.
True alarm.
Yeah, but definitely like a lot of stylistic juxtaposition as well. And even like in the writing itself, there's a lot of like beautiful passages and then like really funny or silly ones, and even like character names. Like I feel like we could have talked about character names specifically, but that would take, I think, a lot of time. Yeah, just very much that like fairyland or fairy tale feeling coming up against the human world, which again, the wall between our world and the other world for a lot of people was not actually a wall. It was a very thin veil. Okay, should we get into quotes? Because I'm sure we have quite a few. I actually this is one of the books where like I think in the first or second chapter, and I was already at the point I was like, I am giving up on tabbing everything that I would want to tab, because that's just like, it's not sustainable.
Oh, we're out of tabs.
Yeah, I would run out of tabs, and or it would get to the point where I'm like, I just tabbed like 6 lines on this page. Basically, I have the whole page marked. Even with that, I still had like so many. So
Yeah,
who would like to start?
Well, I just want to say before we start reading quotes, I had sent Kara a message literally on page 3 of this book. I was like, hold on. And I sent her a voice note because I had just read. Long story short, I keep trying to enjoy. Oh my God, what's his name? What's his name who wrote 100 Years of Solitude?
Oh, Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Yes, thank you. I keep trying to enjoy his works of literature, have not been succeeding, but I read one of his novellas, and then in one of the Goodreads reviews for it, someone was like, it's, it's short and blah, 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 but sometimes you just know when a book has literary merit. And I was like, not this one. But then I picked this up and I was like, Kara, this has literary merit. This is good, right? Like, not my favorite story, but it has literary merit. And that's the phrase I'm sticking by.
I love that. And I really hope us hating 100 Years of Solitude and Gabriel Garcia Marquez is like a through line, like a little subplot in the rest of our
That's the season arc for this year.
Will we get over it? And the answer is no.
Never, no.
Add a classies category that's like book with the most literary merit, and it just won't be 100 Years of Solitude, unfortunately.
Any book that's not
actually that would be fun to have a category for, like, we could each pick the book that it's like I didn't necessarily enjoy it the way I wanted to, but the quality.
Yeah.
The quality.
Like Lord of the Flies for me, where I can't stand it. I'm like, I get it.
Oh my God, I finally bought it because here's my thing is I don't know if they have anything to do with each other. Yellow, and anytime I hear anything about that show, I'm like, seems like Lord of the Flies to me. So for some reason, I feel like I need to read that before I watch that show. Don't worry, I won't do that. I won't do either of those for like 4 years, knowing myself, but and I won't force you guys to read it. That's my own mission.
If you wanted us to read it, I would, but I am so happy you're pushing it on.
I'm
one and done with that book.
Yeah, that was plenty for me. Okay, cool. Quotes. Who wants to start? And I think we should just like round table, like go around because we're gonna have so many.
I can start because it's a funny quote and not that deep, but I love it. Now, curse happened to be one of the words that had always frightened Master Nathaniel. So much did he dislike it that he even avoided the words that resembled it in sound, and had made Dame Marigold dismiss the scullery maid merely because her name happened to be Kirsty. I was just very tickled by that.
That's the kind of thing where I'm like, I don't like you, Nathaniel.
You're so dumb.
No worries. Okay. I had a specific color for like pretty nature quotes versus like other quotes.
Mm-hmm.
To the imaginative, it is always something of an adventure to walk down a pleached alley. You enter boldly enough, but very soon you find yourself wishing you had stayed outside. It is not air that you are breathing, but silence, the almost palpable silence of trees.
Okay.
The imagery, man.
I'm going to apologize in advance because I feel like a lot of the quotes I saved are like 3 paragraphs long, but she just kept saying good shit, so I had to keep underlining. I couldn't stop until she was done. So again, this is from the beginning. It is never safe to classify the souls of one's neighbors. One is apt, in the long run, to be proved a fool. You should regard each meeting with a friend as a sitting he is unwillingly giving you for a portrait that probably, when you or he die, will still be unfinished. And though this is an absorbing pursuit, nonetheless, the painters are apt to end pessimists. For however handsome and merry may be the face, however rich may be the background, in the first rough sketch of each portrait, yet with every added stroke of the brush, with every tiny readjustment of the values, with every modification of the, what was that painting word? I don't know.
Chiaroscuro.
Yeah, thank you.
Chiaroscuro.
Perfect. The eyes looking out at you grow more disquieting, and finally it is your own face that you are staring at in terror, as in a mirror by candlelight when all the house is still. Like, what the hell, Hope? This is page 3!
I know. My first one was on page 3 too. I'm like, can we settle down? Like,
Yeah.
I'm about to snort these passages up.
Inject it directly into my veins. I love it.
About to do a line. Literally a line.
That's our next merch.
yes.
Our next is if we've ever followed through on any of these ideas.
I know.
So I have one that's pretty long.
Yes.
I'm next, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I didn't want to cut. But you remember what my father said about the law being man's substitute for fairy fruit? Oh, sorry.
No, that's great. I love this one. Sorry.
Fairy things are all of them supposed to be shadowy cheats, delusion. But man can't live without delusion, so he creates for himself another form of delusion, the world in law, subject to no other law but the will of man, where man juggles with facts to his heart's content and says, if I choose, I shall make a man old enough to be my father, my son, and if I choose, I shall turn fruit into silk and black into white. For this is the world I have made myself, and here I am master. And he creates a monster to inhabit it, the man-in-law, who is like a mechanical toy and always behaves exactly as he is expected to behave, and is no more like you and me than are the fairies. And I would like to apologize for my difficulty reading this. When I say the text is tiny, it's like comedically tiny.
Yeah. No,
we gotta get you some of those like half moon spectacles that are down on your nose. Like.
Yeah, it's such a good quote. One of my favorites, and this is one of the ones where it's like, man, sometimes there was just this line that is like, I think this is incisive commentary all by itself. I would have loved to see more, but man. Never for a moment did Hazel forget that she, not the widow, was the rightful owner of the farm. Should she for once assert her position, and, in direct defiance of the widow, report what had happened to the lawman of the district, and send a messenger to Master Nathaniel? But, as everybody knows, legal rights can be but weaklings, puny little child princes, cowed by their bastard uncles, precedent and seniority.
I saved that one too.
I'm like, oh, that really hits now, Hope. Like, that's yeah.
This is, again, sorry, a little long, but it is the part I was referencing earlier when we were talking about art, when they're talking about the attic. There were whole chests, too, filled with pieces of silk embroidered or painted with curious scenes. Who had not wondered in what mysterious forests our ancestors discovered the models for the beasts and birds upon their tapestries, and on what planet were enacted the scenes they have portrayed? It is in vain that the dead fingers have stitched beneath them, and we can picture the mocking smile with which these crafty cousiners of posterity accompanied the action. The words February, or hawking, or harvest, having us believe that they are but illustrations of the activities proper to the different months. We know better. These are not the normal activities of mortal men. What kinds of beings peopled the earth 4 or 5 centuries ago? What strange lore had they acquired, and what were their sinister doings? We shall never know. Our ancestors keep their secret well. Girl.
So good.
Every time I finish a quote, I'm like, what can I say about it?
There you go. Yeah.
So I have, there's no more foolish proverb than the one which says that dead men tell no tales. To help dead men to find their tongues is one of the chief uses of the law.
Yeah. There's some good law and justice quotes in here.
There are.
I loved this one, obviously. Pride and resentment are not indigenous in the human heart, and perhaps it is due to the gardener's innate love of the exotic that we take such pains to make them thrive.
That's another one of my favorites.
What a beautiful way of describing shitty people. No, I love it.
That's so good. Okay, I have a Nat one. But after he had heard the note, a more stay-at-home and steady young man could not have been found in Lud-in-the-Mist. for it had generated in him what one can only call a wistful yearning after the prosaic things he already possessed. It was as if he had thought them, it was as if he had thought he already lost what he was actually holding in his hands. Oh my God, there's more. Sorry.
The yearning.
I kept underlining. It was so long. Wait. Do I want to read all this part? Okay, wait. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because it's a long thing I underlined. I thought that was it. Hence, at times, he would gaze on the present with the agonizing tenderness of one who gazes on the past. His wife sitting under the lamp embroidering and retailing to him the gossip she had culled during the day, or his little son playing with the great mastiff on the floor. This nostalgia for what was still there seemed to find a voice in the cry of the cock, which tells of the plow going through the land, the smell of the country, the placid bustle of the farm as happening now all round one, and which simultaneously mourns them as things vanished centuries ago. Dang, girl.
It's like that she really does like encapsulate that feeling of like when you are so like happy or at peace that there's a part of you that's sad because it something else will happen.
Mm-hmm.
Bittersweet.
So the one I have is, these vulgar songs, though faded, were not really old. Nevertheless, to Master Nathaniel, they were the oldest songs in existence, sung by the morning stars when all the world was young, for they were freighted with his childhood and brought the memory, or rather the tang, the scent of the solemn innocent world of children. A world sans archness, sans humor, sans vulgarity, where they had sounded as pure and silvery as a shepherd's pie, where the little charmer with her puce bow and the scheming hussy who had cocked her blue eye had been own sisters to the pretty fantastic ladies of the nursery rhymes, like them walking always to the accompaniment of tinkling bells and living on frangipane? Frangipane? I don't know.
Depends on where you're from. You can pronounce it differently.
Amazing. Well, where I'm from, we pronounce it frangipane. And syllabubs of peaches and cream, and whose gestures were stylized and actions preposterous. Nonsense actions that needed no explanation. While mother-in-law's shrewish wives falling in love, they were actions that needed no explanation. Nope, I totally read that wrong. Never mind. Falling in love, they were just pretty words, like brightly colored beads strung together without meaning. I cannot read this book. But I just want like a description of like being nostalgic for childhood and that sort of like lack of cynicism that you tend to get as you get older.
Yep. We have the misfortune of living in a country that marches with the unknown, and that is apt to make the fancy sick. Though we laugh at old songs and old yarns, nevertheless, they are the yarn with which we weave our picture of the world.
Dang. Hope, come on. As you can tell from my quotes, the first few chapters especially were like my favorite. I just loved the little slice of life stuff. And this was in the part when they're having guests over and they're all like joking around with each other. Anyhow, everyone there tonight shared the same totem, and each one of them was the hero of one of the old jokes. Master Nathaniel was asked if his crimson velvet breeches were a blackish crimson, because many years ago he had forgotten to go into mourning for his father-in-law, and when Dame Marigold had finally tentatively pointed out to him his omission, he had replied angrily, "I am in mourning." Then, when, with upraised eyebrows, she had looked at the canary-colored stockings that he had just purchased, he had said sheepishly, "Anyhow, it is a blackish canary." Few wines have as strong a flavor as the grape of this old joke had of Master Nathaniel. His absent-mindedness was in it, his power of seeing things as he wanted them to be. He had genuinely believed himself to be in mourning. And finally, in the blackish canary, there was the tendency which he had inherited, perhaps, from his legal ancestors, to believe that one could play with reality and give it what shape one chose.
So good. And honestly, such a funny like image too of her like looking at his stuff.
Blackish yellow.
I am in mourning. And she's like, okay.
So I only have one quote left, and it's the last line of the book because I just really loved how
Yes.
she like wrapped it up. It felt so much like a storybook.
Yeah.
An epitaph not unlike those he used to con so wistfully in his visits to the fields of Gramarye. And this is but another proof that the written word is a fairy, as mocking and elusive as Willy Wisp, speaking lying words to us in a feigned voice. So let all readers of books take warning. And with this final exhortation, this book shall close. I don't know. It felt just so like
Yes, I love it. I love it. And again, very much Midsummer Night's Dream vibes
yeah.
with Puck's like outro at the end. Um, this is another one about history. I feel like I should have done a whole tab color for like history and the past and like the stories of the past.
Yeah.
He's talking about reading the old records that were like handwritten. It made the past very real, and threw a friendly, humorous light upon the dead, to come upon, when turning those yellow parchment pages, some personal touch of the old scribes, such as a sententious or facetious insertion of his own. For instance, the law bides her time, but my dinner doesn't, or the caricature in the margin of some forgotten judge. It was just as if one of the grotesque plaster heads on the old houses were to give you suddenly a sly wink. I love that. It's like when it's like you see like old illuminated manuscripts from like the 5th century, and there's like a cat paw, print. Yeah, love it.
I'm trying to decide. I have so many. This is early in the book when Nathaniel's kind of confronting Ranulph about his odd behavior. But Ranulph's sobs redoubled. "I want to get away, he moaned. Away from where?" And there was a touch of impatience in Master Nathaniel's voice. From things happening," sobbed Ranulph. Master Nathaniel's heart suddenly contracted, but he tried not to understand. "Things happening," he said in a voice that he endeavored to make jocular. "I don't think anything very much happens in Lud, does it?" "All the things," moaned Ranulph. "Summer and winter and days and nights, all the things." Master had a sudden blood and the surrounding country, motionless and soundless, as it appeared from the fields of Gramarye. Was it possible that Ranulph, too, was a real person, a person inside whose mind things happened? He had thought that he himself was the only real person in a world of human flowers. For Master Nathaniel, that was a moment of surprise, triumph, tenderness, alarm.
Such a pretty way to say like Nathaniel finally learned how to empathize with someone.
Nathaniel realized there are other people in the world. Like,
Whoa.
what a concept. This is another tapestry. Like, of course, I like all the needlework stuff.
Yeah, you do.
This is when they discover the like hidey hole with all the fruit. They were dumb with amazement. This was as different from all the other tapestry they had ever seen as is an apple tree in full blossom against a turquoise sky in May to the same tree in November, when only a few red leaves still cling to its branches and the sky is leaden. Oh, those blues and pinks and brilliant greens! In what miraculous dyes had the silks been dipped? As to the subjects, they were those familiar to every Doramarite. Hunting scenes, fugitives chased by the moon, shepherds and shepherdesses tending their azure sheep. But, depicted in these brilliant hues, they were like the ashes of the past, suddenly, under one's very eyes, breaking into flame. Hey presto, the men and women of a vanished age, noisy, gaudy, dominant, are flooding the streets, and driving the living before them like dead leaves.
Yeah, buddy. There's so many good ones.
Yeah.
Ugh. And see, okay, I have the like introduction to Endymion Lear where I was like, oh, good guy.
Yeah.
Among the humbler classes, his was a name to conjure with, for he was always ready to adapt his fees to the purses of his patients, and where the purses were empty, he gave his services free, for he took a genuine pleasure in the exercise of his craft for its own sake. One of the stories told about him was that night when he had been summoned from his bed to a farmhouse that lay several miles beyond the walls of the town, to find that when he got there, that his patient was only a little black pig, the sole survivor of a valuable litter. But he took the discovery in good part and settled down for the night to tend to the little animal, and by the morning he was able to declare it out of danger. When, on his return to Lud-in-the-Mist, he had been twitted for having wasted such time on such an unworthy object, he had answered that a pig was thrall to the same master as a mayor, and that it needed as much skill to cure as one as the other. No, to cure the one as the other, adding that a good fiddler enjoys fiddling for its own sake, and that it's all the same to him whether he plays a yokel's wedding or a merchant's funeral. But now I'm like, oh.
I know. Remember when we liked him?
And then I'm like, you little sneak mentioning a fiddler. I'm onto you now.
Yep. I think I only have a few more. After he reads the entry on the berries of merciful death, which what a great name as well.
It's an epic name.
There was something sinister in the silent language in which dead men told their tales, with sly malice embroidering them on old maids' canvas work, hiding them away in ancient books, written long before they were born. And why were his ears so attuned to this dumb speech? For him, the old herbalist had been describing a murderer, subtle, sinister, mitigating dark deeds with mercy, a murderer the touch of whose bloody hands was balm to the sick in body, and whose voice could rock haunted minds to sleep. And as well, in the light of what he already knew, the old herbalist had told a story. A violent, cruel, reckless woman had wished to rid herself of her enemy by the first means that came to her hand, osiers, the sap of which produced an agonizing, cruel death. But her discreet, though murderous lover, took the osiers from her, and gave her instead the berries of merciful death.
Woohoo! I'm like, I don't know how much we're willing to carry on with this because I'm trying to be like, okay, which quotes do I want to prioritize?
No, I'm just picking my greatest hits at this point.
Greatest hits.
Greatest hits.
There was one quote I wished I saved, but one of the characters has a pug, and they mentioned the pug like sniffing and choking, and I was like, "You really got what a pug does?" Because that's about it.
So
They do sniff and choke. I just marked. I'm not gonna like read them because the quotes themselves aren't that, I guess, interesting, but I liked that there were a couple of places where characters were like, well, girls will be girls, because that's like so very much not what we usually hear. And I think the doctor at one point describes young girls as 1/4 boy and 3/4
bird.
And I'm like, I love that. I don't know what it means.
I was like, you're either amazing for saying that or I'm very insulted, and I don't know which.
Exactly. Yeah.
You kind of got gender theory, but also you're really way off.
Okay, I'm going to apologize in advance because I have two quotes that are saved that are both long, that are separated by only one line. So I'm just going to read it all as one thing, and we're just going to pretend like I'm not reading a whole page to you guys. Okay. But God, the writing's so good. Where is this in the story? We'll figure it out. Okay. Indeed, the only moments of relief he knew were in pacing up and down his own pleached alley or wandering the fields of Gramarye. For the fields of Gramarye gave him a foretaste of death, the state that will turn one into a sort of object of art. That is to say, one is remembered by posterity. Okay, that's a weird turn of phrase. Anyways, with all one's deeds and passions simplified, frozen into beauty, an absolutely silent thing that people gaze at and that cannot turn its gaze back at them. And the pleached alley brought him the peace of still life that neither moves nor suffers, but only grows in silence and slowly matures its secret. But sometimes, as he wandered in the late afternoon about the streets of the town, human beings themselves seemed to have found the secret of still life. For at that hour, all living things seemed to cease from functioning. The tradesmen would stand at the doors of their shops, staring with vacant eyes down the street, as detached from business as the flowers in the gardens, which looked as if they too were resting after their day's work and peeping idly out from between their green shutters. And the lads who were taking their sweethearts for a row on the dapple would look at them with unseeing eyes, while the maidens gazed into the distance and trailed their hands absently in the water. Even the smithy, with its group of loungers at its open door, watching the swing and fall of the smith's hammer and the lurid red light illuminating his face, might have been no more than a tent at a fair where holiday makers were watching a lion tamer or the feats of a professional strongman. For at that desultory hour, the play of muscles, the bending of resisting things to a human will, the taming of fire, a creature more beautiful and dangerous than any lion, seemed merely an entertaining spectacle that served no useful purpose. The very noises of the street, the rattle of wheels, a lad whistling, a peddler crying his wares, seemed to come from far away, to be as disembodied and remote from the activities of man as is the song of the birds. Whew, sorry.
Good.
But I'm like, I don't know. There's something about, and again, this is what I loved, like, especially in the first kind of third of the novel when I was really in it, which is, again, to say before the murder mystery kind of whole. It just seemed like there was this overarching theme, particularly that she was exploring with Nat, that was like being alive but not experiencing life. That I just,
Way to put it.
I was eating it up. I loved it.
Yeah. Longing. I think if it's okay with y'all, I'm gonna just like run through my last couple at once.
Do it.
And then if Julia wants to finish up, we can call
I
it
know.
good. I know this has been such a long discussion, but there's so much to say about this book.
It's just me reading the whole book. Like, I love this quote from beginning to end.
So like I actually just noticed that these are sort of like connected, because one of them that I loved was, it's describing the trees. Now and then one of the bleeding, tortured-looking liege oaks would drop an acorn with a little flop, just to remind you, as it were, that it was leading its own serene vegetable life, oblivious of the agony ascribed to it by the fevered fancy of man.
Dang.
And then there's the part that Lear says, again, trees, "My friends, you are outcasts, though you do not know it, and you have forfeited your place on earth. For there are two races, trees and man, and for each there is a different dispensation. Trees are silent, motionless, serene. They live and die, but do not know the taste of either life or death. To them a secret has been entrusted, but not revealed. But the other tribe, the passionate, tragic, rootless tree, man, alas, he is a creature whose highest privileges are a curse. In his mouth is ever the bittersweet taste of life and death, unknown to the trees. Without respite he is dragged by the two wild horses, memory and hope, and he is tormented by a secret that he can never tell. For every man worthy of the name is an initiate, but each one into different mysteries. And some walk among their fellows with the pitying, slightly scornful smile of an adept among catechumens, and some are confiding and garrulous, and would so willingly communicate their own unique secret, in vain, for though they shout it in the marketplace, or whisper it in music and poetry, what they say is never the same as what they know, and they are like ghosts charged with a message of tremendous import, who can only trail their chains and gibber."
Thank you for sparing me reading that long one, because yeah,
It's so good. And again, it's like the idea of like knowledge connected with like trees and fruit. And also it reminded me of like how people say in general that like one of the things that makes humans like special above other animals is that we know that we're going to die, like we have a sense of mortality. And I find that so interesting, the way he compares that with trees. But also how then like the idea of everybody having this great knowledge that we can't share because it's like we know it and we can't communicate it. I don't know. Just gave me a lot of feelings. Okay, Hope. Thank you. I marked the scene where Nathaniel basically like legislates the girls out of being sold, and I love that. Let's see. Okay, I think this is almost my last one. This is when Ambrose stands up and he's like, "What if we just have fairy fruit?" And everybody's like, "Whoa!" He ended thus. One of our proverbs. Oh wait, no, it's before that. Then, with a certain rough poetry breaking through the artificial diction of the Senate, he began to speak of the events of the year that was nearly over, and the lessons to be learned from them. And the chief lessons, he said, were those of humility and faith. He ended thus. One of our proverbs says, "Remember that the dapple flows into the Dal." I have sometimes wondered recently whether we have ever really understood the true meaning of that proverb. Our ancestors built our town of Lud-in-the-Mist between these two rivers, and both have brought us their tribute. The tribute of the Dal has been gold, and we have gladly accepted it, but the tribute of the Dapple we have ever spurned. The Dapple, our placid old friend, in whose waters we learned as lads the gentle art of angling, has silently, through the centuries, been bringing fairy fruit into Doramer, a fact that, to my mind at least, proves that fairy fruit is as wholesome and necessary for man as the various other gifts brought for our welfare by our silent friends. The Dal's gift of gold, the earth's gift of corn, the hill's gift of shelter and pasturage, and the tree's gift of grapes and apples and shade. And if all the gifts of life are good, perhaps too are all the shapes she chooses to take, and which we cannot alter. The shape she has taken now for Doramer is that of an invasion by our ancient foes. Why should we not make a virtue of necessity, and throw our gates wide to them as friends? Nana's here wants the forbidden fruit. I'm not well, and as we've been discussing for like almost 3 hours at this point, one of the I think takeaways is that the forbidden fruit is actually not that bad for you.
Yeah. Well,
yeah. Which also the silent people, I forgot to mention that I think that is also a common like previous name for the dead / fairies, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. Is that my last one? I think I'm done. The accounts of what took place immediately after the entry of the fairy army read more like legends than history. Again, very thematically appropriate. I think that might be it. Yeah. The last thing, and this was one of those classic, like, I don't know if I marked a particular line or if I was just like, this scene vibes. Because it's when Lear and Ambrose and Nathaniel are talking about like, wow, what a year, huh? And how like everything ended up like working out strangely. Let's see. All of us, that's to say those of us who had parts to play, seemed to be living each other's dreams or dreaming each other's lives, whichever way you choose to put it. And the most incongruous things began to rhyme. Apples and bleeding corpses and trees and ghosts. Yes, all our dreams got entangled. Lear made a speech about men and trees, and I find the solution of the situation under a herm, which is half a man and half a tree, and you see the juice of fairy fruit and thinks it is the dead bleeding, and so on. Yes, my adventures went on getting more and more like a dream till the climax. And he paused abruptly. And then, all the things that you know at first hand, I can only take on faith. This is Ambrose saying to him. Suppose, Ambrose, that what we know at first hand is only this, that there is nothing to know, said Master Nathaniel a little sadly. Then he sank into a brown study, and Master Ambrose, thinking he wanted to be alone, stole quietly from the room. Master Nathaniel sat gazing moodily into the fire, and his pipe went out without his noticing it. Then the door opened softly, and someone stole in and stood behind his chair. It was Dame Marigold. All she said was, "Funny old Nat," but her voice had a husky tenderness. And then she knelt down beside him and took him into her soft, warm arms. And a new hope was borne in upon Master Nathaniel that someday he would hear the note again, and all would be clear. Anyway. And like the way it ends with hope, where it's like, he's like so sad at the prospect of like, maybe we just know that we don't know stuff or that we can't control things, but then like it ends with that like, I don't know, hope for the future. Anyway, that was a lot.
I have a couple more. They're very short, I promise.
Yeah.
Okay. Did someone read this one? I don't think so. In this magically sweet music, once more he had heard the note. It held this time no menace as to things to come, but it aroused in his breast an agonizing tumult of remorse for having allowed something to escape that he would never, never recapture. It was as if he had left his beloved with harsh words and returned to find her dead. Oof. I know. I like this part at the end with Ambrose about his daughter. I don't know like why she even included this, but I was like, I like it. One would not have imagined that a daughter in this condition would have met with much sympathy from Master Ambrose Honeysuckle. Nevertheless, his tenderness and patience with Moonlove proved boundless. Night after night he sat by her, holding her hand till she fell asleep, and by day he soothed her ravings, and in her quieter moments they would have long intimate talks together, such as they had never had before she ran away. And the result of these talks was that his still but fundamentally honest mind was beginning to creak on its hinges. And he would actually listen without protest when Moonlove expressed her conviction that although fairy fruit had robbed her of her peace of mind, nevertheless nothing but fairy fruit could restore it to her, and that at Miss Primrose Crabapple's she had either been given the wrong kind or not enough. And my last one, which goes full circle with Nat. You may perhaps have been wondering why a man so full of human failings and set in so unheroic a mold as Master Nathaniel Chanticleer should have been cast for so great a role. Yet the highest spiritual destinies are not always reserved for the strongest men, nor for the most virtuous ones.
Yep.
So
Which
good.
like perfectly sums up several of our discussions. And all right. This is we're gonna let everybody go decompress from this TED Talk. Actually, not a TED Talk because those are like short.
Yeah.
This was a seminar, a college seminar on Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. Thank you to Nana hanging out with us and anyone else who was in and out or who watches this back later. Reminder that I recently posted a video on my channel that goes over our selections for the rest of the year. And Julia, if you want to share very briefly what our next month's book is going to be, I think that's going to be it.
Yes, I'm very excited to share that we have another nonfiction work coming up. Ooh. We'll be reading The Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon. I did look up how to pronounce it.
Yay.
And yeah, she was like a Japanese court lady in, I believe, 10th century Japan. Yep. And so this is very much like her journal. So it's supposed to be humorous, insightful, lots of good stuff. So
I'm excited.
I'm so excited.
Like the 10th century gossip, it's going to be great. Like,
yeah. Oh, yeah. I flip to the middle to be like, what's this going to be like? And I keep accidentally landing on one that's like, a thief came in. We knew exactly where he was hiding. And I'm like, wait, what? So I'm excited.
This is going to be a wild ride.
Yeah.
So that'll be hosted on Julia's channel. We will update about the date and time. But yeah, Taylor and Julia, thank you as always for your wonderful insights and discussions, especially for such a long live show. Yeah, and thank you everybody else as well. We will see you next month. And don't forget, I have linked Julia and Taylor in the description box. I will also put our Instagram and Twitter links in there later, so we should be good to go. But I think that's everything. Do you guys have anything to add?
No, thank you for hosting, Kara.
Yeah.
Thank you for your insightful questions.
Of course. Thank you for your insightful answers. We're all so good at this. I love
Almost
it.
like we've been practicing for a couple of years or something.
I know. I know. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Now we're going to end stream for like 20 minutes. Always